Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I still remember the day I decided to rent the room in that old building. I was a college student, fresh off a summer of odd jobs and late nights, trying to pay my way through school. The dorms were cramped, and the off-campus housing had long wait lists, so when I saw the ad on the bulletin board, I didn't think twice. The room was cheap, too good of a deal to pass up. They were asking for someone to move in right away, and honestly, I was desperate. It was a run-down old place, the kind that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The building itself was massive, with crumbling walls and dimly lit hallways that stretched on longer than you would expect for such an old structure. It had once been a hotel, or so the landlord had said, though I couldn't figure out why anyone would want to stay in such a dilapidated place back in the day. The floors creaked underfoot, and there was a faint smell of mildew in the air. But it was cheap, and I was only looking for a roof over my head, not luxury. I met the landlord, a man in his late 50s. His face hardened with years of smoking, though he had that familiar, somewhat weary expression that made you feel like he had seen more than his share of life's hardships. His name was Mr. Hammond. He wasn't much for conversation, but he assured me the room was exactly what I needed, a private space for the right price. After all, he had a reputation for providing affordable housing to students. My room was on the third floor, tucked away in the back corner of the building. The hallway leading to it was narrow, the lights flickering as I made my way down the hall. The room itself wasn't much, just a small space with a bed, a desk, and a single window that looked out over the alley. It felt a little strange, almost as though the walls were holding secrets, but I dismissed it as nothing more than my imagination. I wasn't expecting to spend much time in the room anyway. I had classes to attend, papers to write, and friends to hang out with. My days were busy, and I thought that the little room would be just a place to sleep and store my things. But the more I settled in, the more I started to feel like there was something about that building. Something off. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my belongings and began my usual routine, walking to class in the morning, meeting friends for lunch, and retreating back to my room when the day was done. I had no real reason to feel anything unusual. The building, despite its age and condition, was quiet, and I figured it would stay that way. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I remember the first night I spent there like it was yesterday. I was sitting at my desk, trying to finish an assignment when I heard a soft thud, like something falling onto the floor. I paused, listening intently. The sound had come from the hallway, but when I went out to check, I found nothing. No one was around. The hallway was empty, dimly lit as usual. I shrugged it off, returning to my work. But over the next few days, I started hearing other sounds. Footsteps at night, faint whispers, doors creaking open and closed when no one was around. I convinced myself it was just the old building settling, the noise of time catching up with the structure. After all, this was an ancient building, and I was sure the floors and walls had their own rhythm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would cross paths with some of the other tenants, but the building seemed largely abandoned. There were only a few people living on the upper floors, and they were mostly quiet, keeping to themselves. One tenant, a woman who lived on the second floor, seemed friendly enough, but she had this distant look in her eyes, as though she was always somewhere else, mentally. She never lingered long enough for conversation. I kept to myself for the most part, but it wasn't long before I started to notice the odd behavior of some of the other tenants. A man on the fourth floor, for example, would disappear for days at a time, only to return looking disheveled and unwell, like he hadn't slept in days. The woman from the second floor would sometimes be seen pacing outside her room at strange hours of the night. It was almost as though the building had a strange effect on its residents, driving them into odd habits. And then, things started to get stranger little things that weren't so easily explained away. My room's temperature would fluctuate wildly for no reason, the air growing stiflingly hot one minute and freezing cold the next. My belongings would be moved when I was sure I hadn't touched them. I could have sworn I left my jacket on the chair by the window one evening, only to find it hanging up neatly on the back of the door the next morning. I figured it was just me being absent-minded, but the unease kept creeping in, like a shadow I couldn't quite escape. It wasn't until one late afternoon, when I was coming back from class, that I felt the first real sense of dread. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed a strange shift in the atmosphere. The air was thick, oppressive, like it was holding its breath. The sounds of the building, the creaks and groans of old wood seemed to grow louder, more pronounced. When I reached my room, the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I left, but there it was sitting open, inviting me in. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart racing. The room was exactly as I had left it, but there was a strange weight to the silence. I couldn't explain it, but I felt uneasy. It wasn't long before I started hearing things again, whispers, muffled voices coming from somewhere deep within the building. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. But that night, I chalked it all up to stress. Maybe it was the pressure of college life. Maybe it was the isolation of living in such an old, abandoned building. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and go to sleep, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, when I was getting ready for class, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, strange mark on the wall near my bed, a scratch, long and jagged, like something had scraped across it, but there was no way it could have come from me. I hadn't touched the wall, let alone scratched it. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind. I wish I had left then, but I didn't. And that's when everything started to get worse. The days blended into each other as I continued my routine at the old building. I focused on my studies, attending classes, and trying to avoid the creeping feeling that something was off. However, it wasn't long before the subtle signs of something strange became impossible to ignore. One evening, I had stayed up late working on an assignment. I had been sitting at my desk for hours, only pausing briefly to glance at my phone or stretch my legs. The building was quiet as usual, and the only sounds were the rustling of my papers and the distant hum of a radiator somewhere in the hall. But that night, something was different. It began with the lights. I had just finished a section of my paper and leaned back in my chair to relax for a moment. The light overhead flickered, like a faint stutter, before going out completely. I didn't think much of it at first, just another faulty bulb, probably. I reached for my phone to check the time, but as I did, I noticed the shadows on the walls shifting, stretching longer than usual. I glanced up at the window, and for a split second, I could have sworn the reflection in the glass wasn't mine. I froze, staring at the window for a few seconds, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I quickly shook it off, blaming it on fatigue, and got up to check the bulb. As I fiddled with the switch, the light flickered back to life, bright and steady. It wasn't unusual for old buildings to have electrical issues, but still, I felt a prickling unease. I returned to my desk and tried to focus, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt thicker, heavier, and then it happened again. I had just gotten back into my chair when I heard a soft thud from the other side of the room, near the window. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct, something small hitting the floor. I looked up, my heart racing for no reason at all. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a book that had fallen off the shelf by accident. But when I stood up to check, there was nothing there. No book, no object out of place. For the first time, I felt genuinely uneasy. I checked my watch and saw that it was nearing midnight. I told myself to just go to bed and not worry about these little things. After all, I had heard strange noises in old buildings before, and the flickering lights could be nothing more than faulty wiring. But when I turned off my desk lamp and slid under the covers, the feeling of being watched lingered. The room seemed colder, despite the heat from the radiator. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but sleep didn't come easily. As I lay there, trying to calm my nerves, I heard it again, the soft thud, this time much closer, almost right beside me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I shot up in bed. The room was still, too still. The sound had come from the other side of the room, near the window again. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should investigate. But my curiosity won out. and I slowly slid out of bed, feeling the cold wood beneath my bare feet. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. Silence. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was faint, barely noticeable, a shadow shifting in the farthest corner of the room. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for any shadow to be moving, yet there it was, like something or someone was standing just out of my view. My mind raced. I took a step forward, hoping to get a better look, but the shadow vanished the instant I moved. I stood frozen, unsure of what to think. It wasn't like I had seen an actual figure, but the strange feeling remained. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks, brought on by exhaustion. But as I returned to bed, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept the covers pulled tight, and my eyes flicked nervously toward the darkened corners of the room. The next day, I tried to shake it off. It was easy to dismiss these things when the sun was out, and the building was alive with the hum of normal daily activities. I went to class, met up with friends for lunch, and returned to my room in the late afternoon, determined not to let the previous night's events rattle me. However, the room still felt different. It wasn't the same place I had moved into a week ago. The air felt thick, and the shadows seemed to grow longer as the evening drew near. I had dinner in my room that night, something quick and easy, and once again tried to focus on my homework. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but glance toward the window, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the reflection. The evening passed without incident, and I finally called it a night, turning off the light and lying down in bed. I didn't even want to acknowledge the weirdness that had been building up. I told myself it was just the stress of being a student, juggling work and school. It was the perfect excuse, and I clung to it, convincing myself that there was nothing wrong. But then, something even stranger happened. I was in the middle of a dream, at least. I thought it was a dream when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. My eyes snapped open, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was pitch dark, but I could hear the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, coming closer and closer. I sat up in bed, my body rigid with fear. The footsteps grew louder, but there was no one there. I listened closely, waiting for the sounds to stop, but they continued. It was as though someone was walking around my room, circling me, yet I saw nothing. My breath quickened, and I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. But the sound was so real. The steps stopped. Silence! I lay there in the darkness, my pulse racing, unsure of what to do next. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look around and confirm my worst fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something I couldn't see. Finally, the footsteps faded, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself that it had to have been my imagination, my mind playing tricks after a long day. But I didn't dare get out of bed to check the room. I just stayed there, waiting for sleep to take me, too scared to move or make a sound. The next morning, I woke up with a lingering sense of dread. Everything in my room seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps. And when I looked at the door, I noticed something strange. The handle was slightly turned, as if someone had been on the other side, trying to get in. I felt a chill run down my spine. No one had been there. No one had opened the door. From that point on, I began to realize that something in that building was different, something I couldn't explain. But I still didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the building was old, and old buildings had quirks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. By now, the strange occurrences in the building were no longer isolated incidents. They had become a constant, a pervasive presence that I couldn't ignore. It was as though whatever was in the room with me was trying to get my attention, nudging me just a little more each day. What began as the occasional flicker of lights and distant sounds had escalated into something far more unnerving. It started on a Tuesday evening. I had just returned from class, my mind preoccupied with a test coming up the next day. My room, however, was unsettlingly quiet. I noticed it the moment I stepped inside, a stillness that felt too heavy, like the air itself had thickened. The room seemed unchanged, yet something was off. The corners of the walls, where shadows should have been soft and natural, looked dark and oppressive. stretching longer than they should. The smell of dust and old wood lingered in the air, but there was something else now, something faintly metallic, almost like iron. I brushed it off as the usual odor of the building settling in for the night and set my bag down on the desk. The old creaky floorboards groaned under my feet as I moved around, but the atmosphere in the room still made me uneasy. It felt like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the sensation, no matter how hard I tried. After a few minutes, I sat down at my desk to start studying. As I opened my textbook, I noticed something strange. One of the papers on my desk, the one I had left in the corner, was now positioned at the center of the desk, as if someone had moved it. I stared at it for a moment, perplexed. There was no way it had just slid there on its own. I hadn't touched it in hours. My heart began to race as I scanned the room, half expecting to see something or someone hiding in the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the quiet hum of the radiator and the flickering of the overhead light. I hesitated for a moment, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe I had moved it without realizing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was changing in the building. Something was growing stronger. Later that night, as I sat on my bed reading, the feeling of being watched returned. This time, it was more intense, as though invisible eyes were fixed on me from all directions. I glanced over at the window and saw that the reflection in the glass was wrong. It wasn't mine. The figure was hazy, indistinct, but unmistakably there. I blinked rapidly, and when I looked again, the reflection was gone, leaving only my own wide-eyed expression staring back at me. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. It was hard to keep my breathing steady, and I couldn't shake the chill that crept over me. I grabbed my phone and sent a text to one of my friends, asking if they'd had any similar experiences in the building. No response. Everyone else was probably asleep. I tried to distract myself, hoping that I was just overreacting. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the unease. The quiet was suffocating. The air was so thick it almost felt like it was pressing against my skin. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind, every tiny sound seemed amplified. I even started hearing whispers at night, low and unintelligible, just outside my door. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. Days passed, and the strange events increased in frequency. I began to notice things shifting in the room when I wasn't around. One morning, I came back to find my desk chair facing the opposite direction from where I had left it. Another time, my bedspread was neatly folded, as if someone had made the bed while I was out. But no one had been there. It was as if the room itself was alive, watching me, reacting to my presence. I tried to brush it all off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the fear was beginning to seep into my every waking moment. Then came the night when the sounds became impossible to ignore. I had just finished studying and decided to relax before bed. I turned off my desk lamp and lay back, staring at the ceiling. But as the darkness closed in around me, I heard its footsteps, soft and measured, as though someone was pacing back and forth in the room. I sat up immediately, my pulse racing. But when I turned on the light, there was no one there. Nothing had changed. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. The footsteps came again, louder this time, as though they were right beside my bed. I could feel the floorboards groaning beneath the weight of invisible footsteps, each one growing closer, closer. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, but when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the outside. I yanked at the handle in panic, my heart hammering against my chest, but the door wouldn't open. The footsteps were now right behind me, just inches away. I could almost feel the cold air that seemed to be emanating from whatever or whoever was standing just out of my sight. My mind was racing, and I thought I might lose control of my sanity. How could this be happening? What was going on? I had to get out of the room. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and began to bang it against the door, hoping someone would hear me. Finally, the door creaked open. I rushed out into the hallway, my breathing shallow, my legs trembling. There was no one there, of course. The hallway was as empty and silent as ever. The only sound, the muffled hum of the building's ancient heating system. I had no idea what to make of it. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself, and then slowly returned to my room. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. There, on my desk, was a small object I had never seen before. It was a delicate porcelain figurine, something that looked like it had been carefully placed in the center of the desk. I hadn't seen it there before. I picked it up, feeling its cold surface against my fingers. It was a little angel, wings spread wide, with a serene expression frozen in time. It was so out of place, so foreign in the context of my otherwise ordinary desk. I turned it over, expecting to find some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing, no label, no identifying mark. It was just there. The sensation of being watched intensified, and it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I couldn't take it anymore. Something had to be done. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, wondering what would happen next. That night, I finally made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening. I wasn't going to sit back and let whatever this was take control of my life. I was going to investigate. I would search every corner of the room, look through the building, and figure out what was behind all of this. I wasn't sure what I would find, or even if I was ready to face it. But at that moment, I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The next few days were a blur of fear and anticipation. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange porcelain angel, the way it had appeared out of nowhere, its chilling presence on my desk. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The room, my entire living situation, felt like it was spiraling out of control. Something wasn't right. Something was hiding, lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And the moment was approaching fast. I spent my days searching for answers, asking around the building, but no one seemed to know anything. No one had heard of strange happenings in the building, not even the janitors who had been working there for years. Everyone was perfectly normal, or so it seemed. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize, no matter how many explanations I came up with in my mind, deep down I knew something was wrong. It was that Friday evening when I reached my breaking point. I was sitting at my desk, flipping through old textbooks and trying to focus on my studies, but the room felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to press in closer. Every flicker of light felt deliberate, like the room itself was alive and watching me. I couldn't concentrate on my work anymore. The whispers returned that night, louder this time. They weren't just distant voices, they were right there, right beside me. It wasn't just in my head. I could hear the words, indistinct and strange, as if someone was speaking in a language I didn't understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my heart rate spike. I stood up, walking quickly to the door. But the second I opened it, the air outside felt wrong. The hallway was darker than usual, as if the shadows stretched further than they had before. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. I hesitated, then shut the door behind me. I turned back toward my desk, feeling the pressure in my chest rise. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I could feel it in my bones. Something was going to happen. Something terrible. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, causing me to jump. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat. The noise had come from the far corner of the room, behind the heavy curtains that blocked most of the light. I couldn't see anything at first, but I felt it. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. The air became so cold it felt like it was seeping into my bones. And then I saw it. The porcelain angel, was it the same one? Was now lying on the floor, but it wasn't just lying there. It was positioned upright, facing me, and I swear I could see a faint, almost imperceptible smile on its face, as if it was mocking me. My heart raced, my pulse throbbing in my ears. I tried to move toward it, but something stopped me. A deep, visceral fear gripped me, paralyzing me in place. The room felt so still, so unnatural. Every noise, every breath, felt like an intrusion. Then I heard its soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking toward me. My entire body froze. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. My eyes shifted toward the corner, where the sound was coming from, and that's when I saw him. A figure, tall and thin, was standing in the shadowed corner of the room. His features were indistinct, blurred like a bad photograph, but I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against my chest. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't real. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, my voice caught in my chest. I couldn't make a sound. The figure didn't move at first. He just stood there, staring at me, or maybe through me, as if he could see everything I was trying to hide. His presence was suffocating, and the longer he stood there, the more I felt like I was suffocating along with him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he took a step forward. The cold air seemed to follow him, swirling around my feet, crawling up my legs like an icy hand. I took a step back, my legs shaking beneath me. He took another step, and then another. He was getting closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears now, too loud, too fast. Sweat broke out on my skin despite the freezing temperature in the room. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't even raise them to defend myself if I wanted to. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was trapped. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, still as a statue. He looked at me through me, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was pale, unnaturally so, with hollow eyes that seemed to have no depth, like dark pools that stretched on forever. His mouth was a thin, twisted line, as if it had been carved into his face. And then, without moving his lips, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." His voice rasped, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against concrete. "You shouldn't have." The words echoed in my mind long after they left his mouth, reverberating through my skull. The room seemed to contract around me, the walls closing in. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me, and then suddenly the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness. For a split second, I thought I had gone blind, but then I realized there was something else. A faint, flickering light was coming from the far corner of the room, where the curtains hung. It wasn't bright, but it was enough for me to see. Enough for me to see the figure move. I backed away, my heart hammering as I fumbled for my phone, trying to use its flashlight to see what was going on. But the light from the phone only made the shadows deeper, more oppressive. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched from every angle. Then, in a blink, the figure was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving behind only a hollow, aching silence. My body still shook with fear, but I couldn't stop myself from looking at the spot where he had stood. That's when I saw it. The porcelain angel was back, now lying face up in the middle of the floor. Its wings, which had once been delicate and serene, were now twisted at unnatural angles, as though they had been broken and reassembled. And then, in the dim light, I saw the most terrifying thing of all. Written across the floor, in what looked like blood, my blood, was a single word. "Leave!" It felt like an order, a command I couldn't ignore. Panic surged through me. I didn't even stop to grab my things. I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to be away. I ran down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind spinning. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever was in that room. The figure, the angel, the whispers. It was all too much. And as I reached the stairs, I looked up one last time at the building, the place I had thought would be my home for the next few months. The building stood silent and still, as though nothing had happened, but I knew better now. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anymore. I ran without looking back. Every step echoed in the empty hallway, and each footfall seemed to draw me further away from the nightmare I had just lived through. The cold that had settled into my bones didn't subside as I sprinted down the stairs, and I could feel it creeping up my spine, following me, clawing at me. I reached the ground floor and nearly barreled into the front door, throwing it open and rushing into the night. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the cracked pavement, my breath coming out in quick, frantic gasps. The night air was sharp, biting at my skin, but it felt like a welcome relief compared to the oppressive cold I had left behind in the building. My hands were trembling, my knees weak beneath me. I leaned against the brick wall of the building, trying to steady myself, my mind racing, the words scrawled in blood. The angel, the figure. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there. That place wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Alive with something dark and malevolent. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at it, half expecting to see another message from my friends, asking why I hadn't responded, but it wasn't a text. It was a call, an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse. There was a pause on the other end. The static crackled, then a familiar voice came through. It was low, distorted, like it was coming from far away, or maybe from inside my head. "You need to leave. Now." The words were cold, deliberate. I froze. It was the same voice. The same rasping tone I had heard just before the lights went out. My throat went dry, and a chill ran down my spine. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The voice continued, as if it were speaking directly into my soul. "The building is not what it seems. It's waiting." The line went dead. I stood there, shaking, staring at the phone. I didn't know who had called or how they had known what had happened, but one thing was clear: this was no coincidence. Someone or something was watching me. It had been watching me all along. I looked up at the building, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were dark, the shadows stretching across the facade like fingers reaching for me. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But there was something I had to do first. I couldn't just leave it like this. I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened in that room, what had driven me to the brink of madness. I pulled my phone back out and texted a friend, asking for help. I didn't tell them the full story. They wouldn't believe me. How could they? But I needed someone else to be there. I needed someone to see what I had seen. Within minutes, I got a response. "Come over. We'll figure this out." It was enough. I wasn't alone anymore. I still didn't feel safe, but with someone else there, maybe we could finally make sense of it all. I didn't know what we would find, but I was tired of feeling helpless, tired of running. It was time to face whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted from me. When I returned to the building, I wasn't alone. My friend, Claire, stood by my side, her face full of concern, but also a kind of disbelief. She had never been the type to entertain the idea of the supernatural, but when I told her what had happened, she agreed to help me. I could tell she didn't believe me fully, but she was here, and that was enough for now. We stood in front of the entrance, staring up at the tall, imposing building. It looked so much different in the daylight. It didn't seem so alive anymore, just an old structure, its paint peeling and its windows dusty. The building had been here for years, and yet I knew now that it had always held something else, something that had been waiting for me. "I still don't understand," Claire said, her voice uncertain. "You're telling me there's a haunted room, an angel, and a ghost or whatever who wants you to leave?" I nodded slowly. I didn't know how else to explain it to her, but I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand something. I wasn't lying. And whatever had happened in that room, it wasn't just in my head. "Look, I know how it sounds," I replied, my voice shaky. "But we have to go back. We need to figure out what happened in that room." We walked up the steps, and I pushed open the door, the familiar creak of the hinges sending a jolt of unease through me. The hallway stretched out before us, just as I remembered it, dimly lit, the shadows still feeling too long and too dark. We made our way to the stairs. Claire kept looking around, as if she expected something to jump out at her. I could feel her unease too, but we kept moving forward, step by step, until we reached my apartment door. I hesitated, the fear creeping back into my chest. But Claire, standing next to me, gave me a small nod. Her presence was grounding, and I felt the weight of the past few days lift just a little. The door opened with a soft push, revealing the apartment as it had been left behind. The desk, the scattered books, the broken lamp. Everything was just as it had been. But there was something else, something more unsettling now. The room felt empty. The air was stale, like it hadn't been touched in weeks. The silence was deafening, and then I saw it. The porcelain angel. It was sitting in the center of the room, on my desk, as if nothing had happened. No sign of the blood. No scrawled message. It was perfectly still. I couldn't help it. I stepped forward, slowly, carefully, my heart pounding. I reached out to touch it. The second my fingers brushed against the cold porcelain, I felt something shift. There was a sudden pressure in the air, and for a split second, I thought I saw the shadowy figure from before, standing just behind me, as if watching. But when I turned around, nothing was there. Claire gasped behind me. Is it gone? I nodded, but the feeling of unease lingered. The silence was too thick. Something had changed, but I didn't know what. We left the building that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was still waiting for me, for us. I still didn't have answers. I didn't understand why it had chosen me or what it wanted. But the one thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't go back, not without risking everything. I moved out of the building a few days later, never returning to that place again. But every so often, I'll hear a faint whisper in the silence, a voice from somewhere distant, just outside of hearing. And every time, I remember, it never really leaves. I never found out what was in that room. I never found out who or what had haunted that building. The building was eventually torn down, and the apartment complex was replaced with a new structure. But I can't forget what happened. I sometimes wonder if anyone else has felt the same presence. I wonder if the whispers are still there, waiting for the next person to listen. But for now, it's just me, the quiet, and the unsettling silence that follows me everywhere I go. It's been years since I left that building. Years since the whispers first found me. Years since I ran out into the night, feeling the coldness crawl beneath my skin. But no matter how far I've gone, no matter how many miles I've put between myself and that place, the memories still linger, quietly haunting me in the stillness of the night. I've moved to different cities, lived in different homes, tried to escape the weight of those nights. Yet, there are moments when it feels like it never really left me. The sound of footsteps in an empty hallway, the faintest flicker of light in a room that's supposed to be dark. And sometimes, even in the middle of a crowded street, I'll feel an inexplicable chill creeping down my spine, as if something is watching, waiting. That feeling has become a part of me. I can't seem to shake it, no matter how much time passes. But I've come to understand something over the years. That building those rooms, the dark presence that seemed to haunt every corner, it wasn't just an isolated incident. I've learned that these things, these forces, don't always make sense. They don't follow the rules. They don't play fair. They're not here for closure. They're here because they exist, and they have no end. I've spent hours, days, even years trying to make sense of it all, trying to explain it to myself. But no matter how much I search for answers, I never quite find them. There's no logical explanation for why that building was the way it was. No scientific reasoning behind the things I saw or felt. The world doesn't work like that. And that's what makes it worse, the uncertainty. I don't know what it was that haunted that place. Maybe it was the spirit of someone lost, someone who couldn't move on. Maybe it was something darker, something older than I could comprehend. But in the end, it doesn't really matter, because what I've learned is that not everything can be explained. Not everything has to make sense. Some things just are. And some things stay with you forever. It's been years, and I still wonder about the others who lived there, about the people who walked through that same hallway, opened those same doors, sat in those same rooms. What happened to them? Did they feel the same things I did? Or was I just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Some of them probably moved out, maybe even got the same sense of unease I did, or maybe they never noticed. Maybe they still live there, oblivious to the presence that lingers like a shadow. Or maybe they felt it too. I wish I could tell you that I found the answers, that I figured out the mystery, that I somehow solved the riddle of that room. But the truth is, I never did. And I don't think anyone ever will. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, I guess. There are nights, even now, when I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, as if I've just escaped something, or as if it's still chasing me, still there, waiting to pull me back in. But I've learned to live with it. I've learned to accept that there are things in this world that we can't understand, things that are beyond our grasp. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, the unknown. The truth is, I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed in that building. Would I have seen more? Felt more? Would it have consumed me entirely? I'll never know. What I do know is that I got out. I ran, and maybe that was the only way to survive. But the thing about survival is that it's not always as simple as escaping the immediate danger. Sometimes survival means carrying the scars, the memories, the fear that follows you even after you think you're safe. Sometimes, survival means trying to forget, even when you can't. I don't visit that part of town anymore. I don't even drive down that street. There are places in this world that I will never go back to, not because I fear what's there, but because I fear what it might bring with it, what it might remind me of. As I sit here now, writing this down, I wonder if any of it was real. Maybe I was just overworked, stressed out from school. Maybe the shadows in the hallway were just tricks of my mind, the product of sleepless nights. But then I think about the way the air felt, the way the darkness closed in on me like a weight, like it was alive. And I know deep down that it was real. Too real. I don't know why I'm sharing this now, or if anyone will believe me. Maybe it's just my way of putting it all behind me, of trying to rid myself of the last lingering thread that ties me to that place. Maybe it's a warning, a way to tell someone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. Maybe it's just the need to speak about it, to get it out before it consumes me. But as I finish writing this, as I try to close the door on this chapter of my life, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there. That building, that presence, waiting for someone else. And maybe, just maybe, it's not done with me yet. Because the thing about these kinds of stories is that they don't always end. Not really. They live on, in whispers, in dark corners, in the spaces between the breaths you take when you're alone in a room that feels a little too quiet. And even after all these years, even as I sit in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that there's always something just beyond the edge of my vision. Something that watches. Something that waits. And that's the scariest thought of all. It was a crisp autumn day when my friends and I set out for what was supposed to be a routine hike, one we had taken many times before. We were no strangers to the woods, having grown up just a few miles away. The trail we had chosen was familiar to us, all the Maple Ridge Trail, known for its dense trees and towering canopies, but also for its eerie stillness. Many times we had walked its winding paths, talked through its silence, and laughed through its shadows. To us, the forest had always been a welcoming place. But that morning, something felt different. There was a sense of heaviness in the air as we gathered at the trailhead. The usual chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves were absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I glanced at my friends, each of them equally unsettled by the silence. Still, we shrugged it off. We were used to the outdoors and knew how to handle ourselves in the wild. Our group consisted of 5 people: me, Mark, who was the most experienced in the group, Julia, my best friend, who loved hiking, but was always the first to get scared, David, who had a way of making everyone laugh, even when things weren't funny, and Kate, my childhood friend, who was quiet, but always seemed to notice things others didn't. We met up early in the morning at the usual spot, the corner of the park, where the entrance to the trail was marked with a weathered wooden sign. It looked like it had been there for decades, the letters barely legible, but we all knew exactly where we were heading. It had become a kind of tradition to hike this trail in the fall, when the leaves were changing, and the air was crisp, but not too cold. That morning was no different, or at least, it didn't seem like it would be. As we started walking down the path, the leaves crunched underfoot, and the cool breeze made the branches sway. Mark led the way, as he always did. He was the most seasoned outdoorsman in our group and knew the area better than any of us. We followed, chatting casually, the way we always did on hikes. We passed the usual landmarks, the old fallen tree near the stream, the large rock near the fork in the trail, and everything felt normal. The sun peeked through the trees in rays of gold, and for a while, we let ourselves relax. But then, something strange happened. We reached a part of the trail where we had always stopped for a quick rest. A large boulder sat off to the side, surrounded by wildflowers. But when we reached it this time, it didn't look the same. The flowers were gone, and the boulder itself seemed larger than it had the last time we were here. The space around it, which used to be open and airy, now felt cramped and claustrophobic. I stopped walking for a moment, staring at the boulder, trying to understand what had changed. Mark noticed and turned back, asking if I was okay. I nodded and shrugged it off, but the feeling lingered. "We should keep moving," Julia said, glancing around nervously. "This place is giving me the creeps." David laughed. trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a rock. Relax. You're letting the trees get to you." But Kate, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Does it feel different to anyone else? Like the air's thicker?" We all stopped and turned to her, noticing her pale face for the first time. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at the trees, as if she was seeing something we couldn't. She wasn't usually the type to be unnerved by a simple hike, but something about her expression made me uneasy. "We should keep moving," Mark said, his tone a little sharper now. He had always been the practical one, the one who never let anything get to him. But even his voice was strained, just a little. We moved on, but the unease that had settled over me didn't lift. The further we went, the more I noticed how quiet the forest seemed. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the woods. It was something else, something heavier. The absence of sound felt wrong. Even the wind had stopped blowing. As we continued down the trail, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches more intertwined, blocking out more and more of the sky. The path, which had once been wide and clear, was now narrowing, the earth beneath our feet soft and uneven. I looked ahead, trying to find the familiar landmarks, but nothing looked the same. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked around, I realized that the others had noticed it too. Mark was glancing over his shoulder more often now. Julia kept checking her watch, and Kate had stopped talking altogether. David, who was walking ahead of us, suddenly stopped. His body tensed, and he turned around slowly. "Guys," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "I think we missed the turn." I looked ahead. The path had split off at some point, and none of us had noticed. It wasn't like the usual fork where we could choose between the main trail and the shorter route we had taken a wrong turn. But none of us could remember when it happened. We were lost. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees bending closer as if they were trying to hide us. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. "Let's go back," I said, my voice tight. "We'll retrace our steps and find the right trail." But Mark didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the trees with a strange expression on his face. His eyes were wide, his body rigid, as if he had seen something none of us could see. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly pointed toward the trees, where a shadow seemed to move in and out of view. The shadow wasn't right. It was too dark, too solid, too out of place. It didn't belong in the sunlight filtering through the branches. None of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the strange shape in the woods, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The silence stretched on, but then David broke it, his voice rising in a sharp whisper. "Did you see that? I swear there's something out there." And that's when we realized that whatever we were dealing with was no longer just in our heads. Something was out there, and it was watching us. The air around us grew heavier, thicker, as we stood frozen in place. The distant rustling of the trees, once so familiar, was now replaced by a deafening silence. It wasn't just the absence of the usual sounds of wildlife. It felt like the whole forest had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. None of us said anything for what felt like an eternity, the shadow between the trees lingering just out of sight. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't an animal, not by any stretch of the imagination. The movement was too deliberate, too controlled, as if someone or something was watching us. Waiting, I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I glanced at my friends. Julia was the first to speak, her voice trembling just a little more than she probably wanted to admit. "Did you see that?" Her words were barely a whisper, but they cut through the silence like a knife. We all nodded slowly, but no one dared to speak. Mark, who had always been the calmest of us all, had turned pale. His hand was resting on the hilt of the knife he always carried, a tool for emergencies that we'd never had to use. He never let go of it, even as we moved through the forest. And yet now, his grip was tighter than I'd ever seen. He wasn't just holding it for comfort, he was preparing himself for something. David, on the other hand, was already backing away, his eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the trees. He spoke again, his voice low but sharp. "This doesn't feel right. We need to get out of here." I agreed with him, but part of me couldn't tear my gaze away from the space between the trees. Something was out there, and though I couldn't make it out, I could feel it watching us. The feeling wasn't one of curiosity. It wasn't a deer or some other woodland creature checking us out from afar. This was something else entirely. "Let's head back," Kate said quietly. She had been the quietest of us all, but now her voice was steady, even though her face was pale. "We're not supposed to be here." But Mark shook his head. "No, we stay together. If something's out there, splitting up won't help." His voice was firm, and even though I could see the unease in his eyes, his determination was something I hadn't seen before. It was almost as if he was more afraid of leaving the trail than facing whatever was out there. Still, the rest of us were in no mood to argue. We stayed close, moving as a group, the forest feeling more suffocating with every step we took. But just as we began to turn and walk away from the ominous spot between the trees, something strange happened. A loud snap echoed through the forest, sharp and jarring. It was like a twig breaking underfoot, but the sound was much too loud for that. It was the sound of something large moving through the woods. I stopped in my tracks, my body stiff with fear. Mark's hand tightened around his knife again, and Julia's breath hitched in her chest. David was already a few steps ahead of us, his face strained and pale, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "Did you hear that?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Before anyone could answer, another sound followed this time, a low, drawn-out groan, as if the trees themselves were creaking under an unseen weight. It was an unnatural sound, one that made my skin crawl and my spine shiver. It came from behind us, far off in the woods, but it sounded close enough to make me feel like whatever it was heading our way. "What the hell was that?" David asked, his voice shaking now, not with fear, but with the raw edge of disbelief. He spun around, trying to see what was behind him, but all he saw were the darkening trees and the thickening shadows. Mark was the first to react. "Keep moving," he said, his voice tight but firm. "Don't stop. Whatever it is, we don't want it to catch us off guard." We kept moving, though the air around us felt more oppressive with every step. I glanced over my shoulder, certain I'd see anything moving in the woods, but all I could make out was the darkening silhouette of the trees. The shadows seemed to lengthen as if they were reaching out, inch by inch, closing in on us. The path we were on seemed to narrow the further we walked, and the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwined, blocking out the sky. There were no more sounds of birds or rustling leaves. It was as if the forest had swallowed every sound, and the only noise left was the rhythmic crunch of our footsteps on the dried leaves. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper, barely a sound at all, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a voice, though I couldn't understand the words. It wasn't any of us. It was too distant, too faint, but it sounded like it was coming from the very trees themselves. It didn't have any discernible source, and that was the most unsettling thing. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I stopped, my heart racing. The others didn't notice at first. They were too busy looking ahead, too caught up in the growing tension in the air. But then Mark froze in place. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to speak too loudly. I didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. Mark turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. "It wasn't you?" We all stood in silence, straining our ears. There it was again, a low, raspy murmur, barely audible, like a voice coming from somewhere deep in the trees. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was closer, much closer, and it sounded like it was directly behind us. Julia gasped, spinning around in a panic, but there was nothing there. The path behind us was empty, just the same as it had been moments before. The trees stood tall and silent, but I could feel them pressing in, their twisted trunks casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. "Mark," I said, my voice shaking. "Let's go. Now." Mark didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel and began to walk faster, his eyes darting from side to side, as though he expected something to leap out from the woods at any moment. We followed closely behind him, our pace quickening, though none of us dared to look back. It wasn't until we reached the point where the trail split that something truly strange happened. The path that we had just walked down, our familiar path, was no longer visible. It had disappeared. There was no trace of it at all, no turn to follow, just a thick mass of trees and underbrush where the trail should have been. "We're lost," Kate whispered, her voice thick with fear. None of us said anything. There was no need to. We all knew it was true. The woods, which had always been so familiar, were now foreign to us, and what had once been a harmless hike had suddenly turned into something far darker and more dangerous. Then, from behind us, there was a sound. It was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer, and whatever was following us wasn't making any effort to hide. The footsteps continued, not in quick bursts, not rushing towards us in a frantic chase, but deliberate, measured steps that seemed to echo through the dense forest. Each footfall made my pulse quicken, and I could feel the tension mounting in the air, thick like the humidity that clung to our skin. It was as if the forest itself had become an adversary, drawing us deeper into its embrace with every passing second. We tried to keep moving, but every few steps, we'd glance over our shoulders, half expecting to see someone or something lurking just beyond our sight. The path, which had once felt like a familiar and welcoming route, was now a twisted maze of gnarled roots and darkened trees, each shadow longer than the last. The forest had become its own labyrinth, and we were lost inside it, unsure of how much further we could go before the things that followed us caught up. David, ever the skeptic, was the first to break the silence. "This isn't right. We need to figure out what's going on. This place, it's not the same anymore." Kate, walking beside him, shot him a worried glance. "What are you suggesting? That we're being followed by some ghost or something?" David was silent for a moment. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't one to easily accept the unexplainable, but whatever was happening around us was beyond any logical explanation. The forest felt wrong, and no matter how much we tried to rationalize it, it didn't make sense. "Just keep your eyes peeled," David finally muttered. "I don't like the way this place feels." As we pressed forward, the ground underfoot became more uneven. The path that had once been clear was now almost completely obscured by thick underbrush. The trees, their trunks twisted and contorted, seemed to close in around us, casting everything in an oppressive darkness. It was as if the forest had grown denser in the span of just a few minutes. The whispers returned, softer this time, but unmistakably close. They seemed to come from all around us, quiet murmurs that rode the wind like voices in the distance. But there was something about them that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. They were too clear to be the wind, too precise. The sound seemed to follow us, weaving through the trees like an unseen presence. "Did you hear that?" Julia asked, her voice shaking as she looked around nervously. We all heard it. The rustling of the leaves in the distance was too rhythmic, too structured to be the wind. The faint whispering that had accompanied us earlier was now a low hum, reverberating through the forest like a vibration we could feel deep in our bones. It wasn't normal. I could see Mark's grip on his knife tighten again. His hand was no longer just a casual hold. It was as though he was preparing for something. For what, though? I couldn't say. "We need to find some kind of marker," Mark said, his voice hoarse, though he tried to hide the edge of panic creeping in. "Something that tells us where the hell we are." We all nodded, but no one said anything. We didn't need to. The air around us was thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to pulse with every beat of our hearts. As we pushed forward, I began to notice something odd. The trees, which had once been evenly spaced along the trail, now seemed to bend toward us, their branches stretching out as if reaching for us. The leaves overhead, once a brilliant green, were now a deep, unnerving shade of black, almost like a shadow that had taken root in the canopy itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't just surrounding us, it was closing in. "Do you see that?" Kate asked, her voice a little too loud in the heavy silence. I turned, following her gaze to a cluster of trees a little ways off the trail. There was something there, barely visible at first. A figure standing still among the trees. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, like the shadows had formed a shape in the woods. But as I focused harder, the figure became clearer. It wasn't a person, but something. Something unnatural. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long skeletal limbs that seemed to stretch far beyond what a human could possess. Its shape was hard to discern, as if it were being pulled apart by the shadows around it. Its body rippled like smoke, flickering in and out of focus. Before I could speak, David's voice cut through the air, sharp and panicked. "What the hell is that?" He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the flare gun he had packed for emergencies. The figure didn't move, but I could feel the intensity of its presence, almost as though it were watching us, waiting for us to make the next move. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from the ground on a hot day, distorting the view. "We need to get out of here," Julia said, her voice trembling. "Stay calm," Mark ordered. "Let's just keep moving. We need to stick together." It's probably nothing, but I could see the fear in his eyes, too. He didn't believe that. None of us did. We didn't dare to move forward toward the figure. Instead, we kept walking, slowly, cautiously, eyes darting to every corner of the woods, waiting for the next strange thing to happen. As we moved through the trees, the temperature seemed to drop, though the sun should have still been high in the sky. My breath came out in visible puffs, like it was the dead of winter, though the thick humidity in the air told me otherwise. The deeper we walked, the more the forest seemed to shift, as though the very nature of it was changing. The scent of pine and earth had been replaced by something rancid, the smell of decay, of rot. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural groan, like the earth itself was giving way beneath us. It wasn't the wind, nor the trees creaking under the weight of age. It was something else, something far more menacing. It echoed through the forest, sending ripples of unease through my spine. "We need to get out of here. Now," Mark hissed, his voice strained. His eyes were wide, darting nervously around us. David, who had been the most vocal in his disbelief up until that point, nodded. "No argument here. We can't stay in this place much longer." We turned quickly, retracing our steps. But the path was different now. The trees, which had once seemed spaced out and welcoming, now loomed closer. They were pressing in on us, and every direction I looked seemed to lead to nothing but more trees, more shadows. The more we walked, the more everything seemed distorted. The path we had come from was no longer clear. It had twisted into something unfamiliar. The trees, though still trees, didn't feel like they were part of the same world we had entered at the start. The very air felt oppressive, thick with dread. There was no more light filtering through the canopy. The shadows had taken over. At that moment, a loud crack echoed from behind us like a branch snapping underfoot. It was followed by a low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. We all froze. Whatever was following us was no longer trying to hide. The growl echoed through the dense trees, sending a chill down my spine. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, drowning out the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the wind. I turned sharply, my breath ragged, as I desperately searched for the source of the sound. The forest around us, which had once felt like a simple trail, now felt like a labyrinth of terror, the walls closing in on us with every passing second. David's hand gripped his flare gun so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Mark, still clutching his knife, was scanning the trees, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. His jaw was clenched, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his expression. Julia, who had been walking behind us, was frozen in place, her wide eyes locked on the dark expanse ahead of us. Kate, ever the practical one, was trying to keep it together, but her shaking hands betrayed her. The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. "Move," David whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever was stalking us. But it was too late. Without warning, the shadows in front of us shifted. A figure stepped into view, a tall, impossibly tall creature, with limbs stretched too far, its body distorted and grotesque. Its skin, or what passed for it, was a sickly gray, hanging loosely like decaying leather. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a mass of wrinkled skin and empty eye sockets, its mouth twisted into a permanent snarl. It was like nothing I had ever seen, like something born from the very nightmares that had haunted my childhood. I felt my legs go weak beneath me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the creature that loomed before us. David was the first to react, raising the flare gun and firing it into the air with a loud bang. The flare shot up, bright and blinding, illuminating the clearing around us. For a brief moment, I saw the creature recoil, its form flickering in the light, as if it didn't want to be seen. But the moment passed, and the creature surged forward, faster than I could process, its long, spindly arms reaching out toward us. "Run!" Mark yelled, pushing us forward. His voice cracked with panic, but it was enough to snap me out of my stupor. We turned, sprinting down the trail, our footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth that seemed to grow with every passing second. The forest, once familiar and comforting, had transformed into a nightmare. The path, which had once led us out of the woods, now seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It felt like we were running in circles, the same trees and shadows appearing over and over again, trapping us deeper in the forest. Behind us, I could hear the creature's footsteps, slow at first, deliberate, but growing faster with each passing moment. Its growls had turned into something more guttural, like the sound of a wild animal on the hunt. And every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the flicker of shadows, as if it were just out of reach, always there, but never quite in view. We didn't stop. We couldn't. Kate stumbled, her foot catching on a root that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. She fell hard to the ground, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips as she scrambled to get back up. I didn't hesitate. I rushed back, pulling her to her feet, urging her to keep going. But even as I helped her, I could feel the weight of the creature's presence behind us, pressing in on us like a vice. "We need to split up," David shouted, his voice strained. "We'll cover more ground if we split up." "Are you insane?" Julia screamed, her voice shrill with terror. "We're not splitting up." David didn't wait for a response. Without another word, he veered off the path, disappearing into the dense underbrush. Mark followed, taking a glance back at us before he too disappeared from view. "We can't let them go alone," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to stick together." But Kate, her face pale with fear, grabbed my arm. "No, we need to get out of here. We'll only make it worse if we follow them." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was worse, splitting up or staying together in this nightmare. The creature's growl sounded closer now, almost directly behind us, like it was gaining on us with each passing second. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Kate's hand and pulling her with me as we sprinted further down the trail. The trees blurred around us as we ran, the sounds of the forest muffled by the pounding of our feet against the ground. But I could hear the creature now, its heavy breathing and the rhythmic thud of its movements. We burst out of the dense woods into a small clearing, but it was no sanctuary. The clearing was surrounded by trees that loomed high above us, casting long, stretching shadows across the ground. And standing in the center of that clearing, waiting, was the creature. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, its empty eyes fixed on us, as if it was deciding what to do next. I could feel the air grow thick around me, the weight of its gaze pressing down like a physical force. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tight with fear. Then, without warning, it lunged. I barely had time to react. It was faster than I could ever have imagined, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it covered the distance between us in an instant. I heard Kate scream as the creature grabbed her, its skeletal fingers curling around her arm with a force that made her bones crack. I reached for her, but I was too slow. Everything happened in a blur. The creature's form seemed to flicker and distort, as if it were shifting between dimensions, something beyond the natural world. It opened its mouth, no, its maw, and I saw teeth, sharp and jagged, rows of them, stretching impossibly wide. I screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the force as I rushed toward them. But before I could reach Kate, the creature let out a sound of a horrible, guttural noise that shook the ground beneath our feet, and then it disappeared. Just like that. As quickly as it had come, it was gone, leaving only the faint smell of decay in the air. I stood there, frozen, the forest around me now unnervingly silent. Kate was gone. The world around me seemed to collapse into a state of pure shock. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My heart was still pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What had just happened? Had it all been a dream? Was I imagining this? But there was no time for doubt. Mark and David burst into the clearing, their faces pale, their breaths heavy. They must have heard Kate scream too. What the hell happened? Mark gasped, looking around wildly. He looked just as lost as I felt. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at the spot where Kate had been, the place where she had vanished into the shadows. The creature had taken her, and there was no trace of her left. We were alone now. The creature was still out there, somewhere, waiting, and we had no idea how to escape. We stood there, frozen in the clearing, the scent of decay still hanging in the air. Kate was gone, and I couldn't even process what had just happened. One moment, she was with us, screaming for help, and the next, she was just gone, vanished into thin air, like she had never been there at all. I couldn't stop staring at the spot where she had stood, my mind replaying the moment in agonizing detail. The creature had grabbed her, its long, twisted fingers digging into her arm, and then nothing. It was like she had been swallowed whole by the darkness of the forest. David and Mark were standing a few feet away, their faces pale, their expressions a mirror of my own shock. Neither of them had spoken a word since the creature had disappeared. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Is she? Mark's voice broke through the silence, but the words seemed to trail off, swallowed by the enormity of the situation. I don't know, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know what happened to her. David's eyes were wide, darting around the clearing, but it wasn't just fear in his gaze. There was something else, something darker, something that I couldn't quite place. We can't stay here, he said, his voice shaking. We need to find a way out. Now. I nodded, barely able to think straight, my mind a swirling mess of confusion, disbelief, and raw terror. But David was right. We couldn't stay in the clearing. The creature, whatever it was, could come back at any moment. We needed to get out of the forest, find safety, and maybe, just maybe, try to find Kate, if it was even possible. But how? I looked back at the path, or what I thought was the path. Everything seemed twisted, distorted now. The trail that had once felt familiar, like something we had walked countless times before, now seemed alien, unrecognizable. The trees were no longer the same. Each one felt like it was watching us, looming over us, waiting. We need to move. We need to find an exit, David urged, his voice rising in urgency. Mark, who had been standing quietly beside me, finally spoke up, his voice strained. What if it comes back for us? What if it comes after us next? I couldn't bring myself to say the words aloud, but Mark's question had already been answered. We had seen it, this thing, its towering, grotesque form, its empty eyes, and the way it had moved. It had seemed to shift, to bend reality around it, as if it didn't belong in this world at all. We keep moving, David said, his voice tight with fear, but also with determination. It's the only way. We can't just wait for it to find us again. I didn't argue. I couldn't. There was no arguing with fear, not in a place like this. We began walking, our steps slow and deliberate, each of us scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest, which had once seemed like a peaceful haven, was now our enemy. It felt like the very air around us was thick with something malevolent, something that we couldn't see but could certainly feel. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the creature was out there, lurking just beyond our vision, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As we walked, the silence between us grew heavier. It wasn't just the silence of the forest, it was the silence of our minds, each of us trapped in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of the unexplainable. I glanced at Mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too. Guilt. His gaze flicked briefly toward David, then away, as if he was wrestling with something he didn't want to confront. David, on the other hand, was focused, determined, but there was a flicker of something else behind his eyes. I could see it the way his fingers twitched around the flare gun he still held in his hand, the way he kept scanning the trees like he expected something to leap out at him at any moment. We walked for what felt like hours, but time had lost all meaning in this place. The forest, with its oppressive silence and sense of unease, made everything feel distorted. We weren't sure if we were walking in circles, retracing our steps, or if the forest was just changing around us. Finally, as the daylight began to fade into twilight, we saw it, the edge of the forest, the clearing where we had first entered, where we had parked the car. I couldn't believe it at first. After all that had happened, after everything we had just gone through, we were back where we started. Thank God, Mark muttered under his breath, his voice shaky with relief. We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. We just moved toward the edge of the forest, our steps quickening as we neared the end of the trail. I could hear the sounds of civilization, now cars passing by in the distance, the hum of life beyond the forest. It was a strange, almost surreal sound, like we had just woken from a nightmare, unsure if we had truly escaped or if it was all just a bad dream. When we reached the car, I didn't feel safe. I should have. We had made it out, but the terror of what had happened lingered like a weight in my chest. Kate was gone. I couldn't shake the image of her being taken, her scream echoing in my mind, her figure swallowed by the darkness of the woods. We need to call the police, David said quietly, his voice hoarse. Tell them what happened. We need help. But there was something in his tone, a hesitation, like he wasn't sure what to say, how to explain the unexplainable. I nodded, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the car keys. I couldn't think of anything else to do, but as I started the engine, I realized something. I didn't know what we were going to tell them. How could we explain what had happened in that forest? How could we explain the creature, the shadows, the terror we had felt? The questions were endless, and I didn't have any answers. Not yet. As we drove away from the forest, the last vestiges of daylight fading behind us, I couldn't help but look back. The trees seemed to loom in the rearview mirror, their dark shapes stretching into the distance, as if they were following us, waiting for us to return. I wasn't sure if we had truly escaped. I wasn't sure if we ever would. The forest had taken something from us, and it would never let us forget. We had no answers, only questions, and the feeling that we weren't done with that place yet. The drive back felt like we were moving through a dream that we couldn't shake, no matter how hard we tried. The steady hum of the car's engine was the only sound in the otherwise quiet cabin, and even that seemed too loud, as if it didn't belong in the heavy silence that had taken over the three of us. David had his hands tightly gripping the wheel, his knuckles white under the dim interior lights. Mark was slumped against the window, his eyes fixed on the passing road, lost in thought. As for me, my mind kept drifting back to the forest, to that clearing, to Kate. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about what had happened. The last moments of her voice, her scream echoing in my ears, the terror in her eyes as she disappeared into the dark. I kept asking myself, where had she gone? What had taken her? And, most haunting of all, why had it chosen her? We didn't speak much during the drive. It wasn't that we didn't want to talk, it was that we couldn't. The weight of what we had experienced hung over us like a thick fog, each of us trapped in our own thoughts, struggling to make sense of what had happened. There were no words that could explain what we had seen. How could we even begin to tell anyone about the creature in the forest, about the strange, twisted reality we had found ourselves in? I glanced at David, his jaw set in a hard line. He was staring ahead, his eyes fixed on the road, but I could see the tension in his posture. It was as if he was holding something back, something that he wasn't ready to confront. David, I said quietly, my voice cracking a little as I broke the silence. What do you think happened out there? What was that thing? And Kate, where is she? David didn't respond at first. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could see his grip on the steering wheel tighten even more. His lips parted as if he were going to say something, but he quickly closed them again. After a long, agonizing pause, he finally spoke. I don't know, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I can't explain it. I don't even know if I want to. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. It didn't belong in the forest. It was like it was something from another world. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink into me. Whatever it was, it had been something we couldn't understand. And maybe that was the worst part. The unknown. The fact that we had no answers. Mark shifted in his seat, finally lifting his head to speak, his voice tinged with disbelief. But Kate, she's just gone. We didn't even get a chance to find her. We couldn't do anything. His words were like a punch to the gut. The grief was still raw, gnawing at me from the inside. I couldn't shake the image of Kate's desperate face, her last moments before she was taken. And no matter how many times I tried to convince myself that we had done everything we could, I couldn't get rid of the guilt, the feeling that we had failed her. The rest of the drive passed in silence, the world outside the car growing darker as the night deepened. We eventually reached the edge of town. The familiar streets and buildings, a stark contrast to the twisted, otherworldly forest we had left behind. It felt surreal, like we were stepping back into the realm of the living, away from whatever dark force had controlled that place. But when we pulled up to my apartment, I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. I just sat there, staring out the windshield, my thoughts still tangled in the events of the day. David glanced at me, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We're not going back, right?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not to that forest." I shook my head, too tired to argue. The thought of returning to that place was incomprehensible. No, we weren't going back. We couldn't. "I don't think any of us will ever go back," I said softly, finally finding the strength to open the car door. We all got out, and there was a strange kind of finality to it. None of us spoke again as we walked toward the building, our footsteps echoing in the night. We were all just too drained, too broken by what we had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the images of the forest, of Kate's last moments, of the creature that had stalked us. My mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions, but no matter how many times I turned them over in my head, I came up with nothing. There were no answers. Only the knowledge that something evil lived in that forest, something that we hadn't fully understood, and something that we may never fully understand. But what truly haunted me wasn't the forest, or even the creature. It was the feeling that we weren't done, that the forest hadn't finished with us yet. The following days were a blur. I tried to go on with my life, pretending like everything was normal, but the weight of what had happened was always there, pressing down on me. I couldn't go out without seeing shadows in the corners of my vision, couldn't walk into the woods without feeling the prickle of fear crawl up my spine. It was like I was always waiting for something I couldn't name, to catch up with me, to drag me back into that world of nightmares. And as much as I tried to put it behind me, I couldn't escape the thought that one day the forest would call to me again. We never spoke to anyone about what happened. We couldn't. How do you tell someone about a forest that isn't what it seems? How do you explain a creature that doesn't belong in this world? The authorities, the people in town, they wouldn't believe us. Not unless they experienced it themselves. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm lying awake, I swear I hear whispers on the wind, faint, impossible to place. A reminder that we were not alone, that we had been touched by something dark and ancient, something that had left its mark on us. And I know, deep down, that one day the forest will come back for us, because it never lets go. We never let it go. And that's the way it is with places like that. Once you've seen the darkness lurking within, it stays with you forever. It might be waiting, watching, until the time is right. Until you slip up. Until you're back where it all started. So, I'll keep my eyes open. I'll keep my guard up. Because the forest, it's still out there. And I don't know if we'll ever truly be free from it. It was a time when things seemed simple, almost peaceful. I was just a man looking for steady work, something routine to get me through the days. Life wasn't exciting, but it wasn't bad either. I lived in a quiet town on the outskirts of the city, where the traffic didn't roar constantly, and the skyline was just a distant blur of tall buildings. I'd gotten used to the stillness, to the regular rhythm of my life. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and you could go for days without running into anyone if you didn't want to. I had just gotten out of a job I'd been in for a few years. It wasn't the worst thing, but it wasn't fulfilling. I needed something new, something different. That's when I found the ad for the warehouse job. It was a simple, straightforward listing. Warehouse worker wanted, full-time, good pay, no frills, no gimmicks, and to be honest, I didn't ask many questions. It seemed like a decent gig. The job was for a warehouse on the edge of town, in an industrial district that was mostly deserted. The place was owned by a company I hadn't heard of before, which wasn't unusual. Businesses came and went in places like that all the time. The listing said the hours would be long, but the pay was competitive, and I needed the work, so I applied, and to my surprise, I was hired within the week. The first day was uneventful. I walked in, filled out the necessary paperwork, and was introduced to a few of the workers. There was a man named Jim who worked as the supervisor. He was quiet but polite and had been there for years. Then there was Ben, another worker who'd been with the company for a while. He was friendly enough, though a bit reserved. They gave me the standard tour of the warehouse, explaining where everything was and what I'd be doing. It was a huge place, filled with towering shelves of inventory, most of which I didn't understand, but it didn't matter. My job was simple. I would be moving boxes, organizing stock, and helping with whatever needed to be done. The place was old, but not run down. It had that musty smell of aged wood and metal. The floors creaked with each step I took, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. It wasn't the cleanest place, but it wasn't exactly filthy either. It was just ordinary, and I was fine with that. I wasn't looking for anything spectacular. I just needed something to keep me busy. As the days went by, I settled into the routine. Each day, I'd show up at 8 a.m., clock in, and work alongside the others. There were moments of silence, punctuated by the sounds of boxes being moved and the occasional conversation. It was peaceful in a way, though the place did feel a little isolated. The rest of the industrial area seemed almost abandoned, with only a few other businesses scattered around. Sometimes I wouldn't see anyone else for hours. It was like being in my own little world. Jim, the supervisor, would check in every now and then, but mostly I worked independently. Ben was the same, a quiet guy who kept to himself. There was one other worker, a man named Greg, but he worked nights, so I didn't see him much. I didn't mind. The solitude gave me time to think, time to reflect, and time to escape from the distractions of everyday life. I remember one particular morning clearly. It was around the middle of my first week. The sun was barely up, and the warehouse was just starting to come alive. I had just arrived, clocked in, and was walking down the narrow hallway toward the storage area. The floors were cold beneath my boots, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space. The air had that peculiar stillness to it, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I was almost to the storage area when I heard something. It was faint, but it was there, a soft thudding sound, like something had been dropped, or maybe something was moving. I paused, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just something falling in one of the other aisles. It wasn't uncommon for things to get knocked over in such a big place. But then, as I walked further into the storage area, I noticed something strange. A box, one that had been sitting on a shelf the day before, was now lying on the floor. It was a large cardboard box, the kind that held equipment, and it was tipped over, its contents spilling out across the floor. I couldn't remember seeing it on the ground the day before. Maybe it had fallen, or maybe someone else had knocked it over. I wasn't sure. I bent down to pick it up and noticed something odd. The label was worn and faded, almost as if it had been handled far more than the other boxes around it. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. It was just another part of the job. That day, everything felt normal. The usual hustle and bustle of the warehouse, the sound of boxes being moved, the chatter in the background, all the things that made it seem like just another day at work. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite place. The place seemed quieter than usual, and that weird noise from earlier still lingered in my mind. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But little did I know, that was only the beginning. Something was waiting, something I couldn't yet understand. As the days turned into weeks, I began to get more comfortable with the job, but the warehouse itself, it was starting to feel different. Something wasn't right about the place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, an odd noise coming from somewhere in the building when I was alone. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that would change soon. The days blurred together as the mundane routine continued. I had come to expect the same quiet, repetitive days that filled my time at the warehouse. The isolation, though eerie at times, had become something I learned to ignore. It was just part of the job. But one Tuesday morning, something happened that would change everything. Something small, but enough to rattle me. It started with a noise. It was subtle, but distinct. I was working in the farthest corner of the warehouse, organizing a row of boxes, when I heard a light, almost imperceptible scrape, like the sound of metal dragging across the floor. It didn't sound like a box being moved or equipment being used. It was different, more deliberate. I stood still for a moment, straining to hear. The noise stopped, and I convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. I went back to my task, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the kind of noise that would come from any regular movement in the warehouse. It was too precise, too controlled. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the empty aisles, but saw nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, as though the air had thickened. I let out a breath and pushed the thought aside. I had to focus on my work, but as I bent down to pick up a box, something strange caught my eye. A shadow. It moved across the wall, just out of the corner of my vision. I froze, unsure of whether I had imagined it or not. I turned to look, but the shadow was gone. It hadn't been a person. The warehouse was empty, and the few workers who were around were all in the front office. I looked again, just to make sure, but everything seemed perfectly still. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I could chalk it up to my tired eyes or the dim lighting in the back corner, but still, the feeling lingered, a knot that I couldn't untangle. That was when I first felt it, that subtle sense that something wasn't right in the warehouse. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the strange feeling lingered. Every time I walked through the aisles, I felt eyes on me, though no one was around. The noise, the shadow, they were still in my mind. But I kept telling myself that it was nothing, just my nerves getting the best of me. After all, I was in an old building, and old buildings had their quirks. Then, one afternoon, as I was unloading a shipment from the back of the warehouse, I heard it again, that scraping sound. This time, it was louder, more pronounced. I turned to look, my heart pounding. I scanned the area where the noise was coming from, but again, I saw nothing. No one was there. I called out, a bit more forcefully this time. "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed through the empty aisles, but there was no reply. I didn't wait around to investigate further. I rushed to the area where the sound had come from and found nothing out of the ordinary, just a few boxes stacked up against the wall. I was starting to feel more than just uneasy. I felt watched. The sensation was overwhelming, as if someone or something was observing me from the shadows. I went back to the front office, where Ben and Jim were sitting at their desks. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out a bit too shaky. "Is there anyone else working in the warehouse today?" They both looked up, confused. "No," Jim replied, raising an eyebrow. "Why?" "I heard something," I muttered, trying to brush it off. It sounded like something scraping across the floor. Ben chuckled, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "You sure it wasn't just the floors creaking? This place is old, man. Things make noise." I nodded, though it didn't completely settle the unease I felt. Jim didn't say much, just gave me a quick glance before returning to his work. But the look on his face, there was something in his eyes that made me pause. I couldn't quite place it, but there was an intensity there, like he knew something I didn't. "Just take it easy," Ben added, clearly dismissing my concerns. "It's probably just the building settling or something. Old places like this do weird stuff sometimes." I nodded again, but I wasn't convinced. There was something in the air, something I couldn't explain. Still, I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me. Maybe I was just stressed from the long hours. But as I walked back to the warehouse floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences started happening more frequently. The scraping sound returned, this time louder and unmistakable. It was followed by a soft thud, like something had dropped, though I couldn't see anything out of place. At times, I would hear faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking through the aisles behind me. I turned, expecting to see Ben or Jim, but no one would be there. The place was empty, except for me. One evening, when I was alone in the warehouse, the situation escalated. I was pushing a cart down one of the aisles when I heard a loud bang, followed by a crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. My heart jumped in my chest as I whipped around, scanning the aisle. There was nothing. The sound had come from further down, where the shelves were stacked high with boxes. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried toward the noise, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached the area, I found nothing. No boxes had fallen, no crates had shifted, yet the sound had been unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Was I losing my mind? Was I hearing things? Or was something else at play here? I headed back toward the front office, but just as I turned the corner, I saw a figure. It was just a silhouette, a shadow standing in the far corner of the warehouse. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but it was like the shadow was absorbing the light around it, becoming part of the darkness itself. I stepped back slowly, my breath catching in my throat. As I did, the figure vanished. No sound, no movement. It just disappeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, but nothing came to me. No logical explanation, no reason for what I'd just seen. When I finally made it back to the office, I told Ben and Jim about the shadow, but they just brushed it off as they had before. Probably just the lighting playing tricks on you, Jim suggested, his tone dismissive. This place is old, like we said. Shadows can look funny in the dark, but something in me knew it wasn't just the lighting. Something in the air had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The shadow, the noises, the feeling of being watched. It was all connected somehow, and the more I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the more I felt the weight of something lurking just beyond my sight. The strange events continued, each one more unsettling than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in that warehouse, it was just getting started, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming next. It had been a week since I first noticed the oddities in the warehouse. At first, I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, a combination of fatigue and isolation. But the more time I spent there, the more undeniable it became. Something was wrong. The strange sounds, the unexplainable shadows, the feeling of being watched, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Each day, it seemed like the warehouse was slipping further away from normalcy. The noises were more frequent now. The scraping sound that had initially been a rare occurrence was now a constant companion. I would hear it in the back of the warehouse while sorting through inventory, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make me stop and look over my shoulder. The sound would always stop as soon as I turned my head, but it was never the same. Sometimes it was a slow, dragging noise. Other times it was a quick scrape, like nails across a chalkboard. The inconsistency of it made it worse. One afternoon, I was in the middle of unloading a new shipment when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. It was subtle, but it caught my attention. I shivered involuntarily as the cold air seemed to settle around me, a sharp contrast to the warm, dry atmosphere of the warehouse. I looked around, but there was no explanation for the chill. I walked to the nearest thermostat and checked it. It was set to a comfortable temperature, and the air conditioning was running fine, but the cold didn't dissipate. It lingered, seeping into my bones. I rubbed my arms for warmth, but it didn't help. The sensation of being watched was more pronounced than ever. It felt as if invisible eyes were boring into me, following my every move. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the aisles remained empty. I decided I had had enough of the unease. I needed to get to the bottom of it, figure out if there was something or someone causing all of this. That evening, when the warehouse was completely empty, I stayed behind. Ben and Jim had already left for the day, and I knew I had time to investigate without interference. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the farthest corner of the building, where the shadows seemed to linger the most. The scraping sound was back again. It started low, just a faint drag against the floor, but it was unmistakable. I froze, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint its location. It was coming from one of the long aisles between the rows of shelves. I stepped cautiously toward the sound, my footsteps muffled on the worn concrete floor. As I reached the end of the aisle, the scraping stopped abruptly. I shone my flashlight along the rows of boxes and crates, but there was nothing there. The silence that followed was almost deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned to leave, but then I saw a box had shifted, slightly, its corner peeking out from behind a stack of others. I approached it slowly, my pulse quickening. When I touched it, the box was ice cold. A shiver ran down my spine as I pulled it from the stack. There was nothing inside, just empty space. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I couldn't explain it, but something about that box unsettled me deeply. I placed it back and turned to head back to the office, my heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The warehouse haunted my thoughts, and I found myself replaying the events over and over in my mind. What was happening? Why was I feeling this way? Was there a logical explanation for it all, or was it something more? I had to know, but I wasn't sure I was ready to find out. The next day, I decided to confide in Ben. He had been working at the warehouse longer than I had, and maybe he knew something that could explain what I was experiencing. I found him in the break room, sipping his coffee as usual. "Hey Ben," I started, my voice low. "Can I talk to you about something?" He raised an eyebrow, but gestured for me to sit down. "Sure, what's up?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to bring it up. "Have you noticed anything strange happening around here lately?" He chuckled, setting his coffee cup down. "Like what? The lights flickering again?" "No," I replied, shaking my head. "I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but I keep hearing things. Scraping noises, shadows. I feel like I'm being watched." Ben looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You think you're being watched?" he asked quietly. His voice had lost its usual lighthearted tone. I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "It's not just that. I've seen things. Shadows moving when no one's around." "I don't know, Ben. Something's off." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I've worked here for a long time, man," he said finally, "and I've seen some things too. But you can't talk about it to anyone. It'll just make it worse." I felt my heart rate pick up. "What are you talking about?" I pressed. "What have you seen?" Ben hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You really want to know?" I nodded, unable to look away from him. Ben took a deep breath, his eyes darting around as if he were making sure no one else was listening. "There's something about this place. It's old, and it's seen a lot of things over the years. People have worked here, left, and never come back. Strange accidents, strange disappearances. I don't know the details, but there's something wrong with this place. I've heard things, seen things that shouldn't be real." My pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" Ben stared at me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "There's a part of the warehouse, down by the old storage rooms. People say it's cursed, but I don't know if that's true. I've never gone down there after dark. Something feels wrong about that place. If you keep experiencing this stuff, maybe you should just leave. It's not worth it." His words hung in the air like a warning, but I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Something inside me, despite the fear, wanted answers. I had to find out what was going on. But now, I knew there was more to this place than I had ever imagined. That evening, I decided to take a risk. Armed with my flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I ventured toward the old storage rooms Ben had mentioned. The air felt heavier as I approached, like the warehouse itself was holding its breath. The farther I walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked concrete floor. When I reached the old storage rooms, I stood outside for a long moment, gathering the courage to enter. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and metal filled my nose. It felt as though I had entered another world, a world that was frozen in time. The deeper I went, the more intense the feeling of being watched grew. I could hear faint noises echoing around me, like whispers carried on the wind. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I had reached the farthest end of the hallway when I saw it. A door, slightly ajar. It was the only door in the entire corridor that wasn't completely shut. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't leave without knowing. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. And that's when everything changed. The room beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, its beam barely cutting through the heavy blackness. The air was suffocating, thick with something I couldn't name. And then I heard it. The scrape, louder than ever, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. But there was no one there, just the oppressive darkness, the air so cold I could see my breath in front of me. And then I felt it, a presence. Someone was standing right behind me. I couldn't turn fast enough. The room went silent, too silent. And in that silence, I knew something terrible was about to happen. The events that had been unfolding over the past few weeks had reached a breaking point. Each strange noise, every fleeting shadow, was building towards something I couldn't ignore anymore. The warehouse was no longer just a place where I worked. It had become a prison, a place where the air was thick with something I couldn't explain. As the days went on, the strange occurrences became more frequent and more intense, and I felt like I was losing control of my own thoughts. It started one late evening when I was alone in the warehouse, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. I had been working in the far corner again, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had been gnawing at me for days. The silence in the building was deafening, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above me. I was focused on a stack of boxes when I heard it again, the scraping sound. But this time it was louder, almost urgent, like it was coming for me. My heart raced as I froze, my eyes darting around the darkened aisles. I turned to look, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was in sight. The noise continued, now sounding like footsteps, heavy and slow, as though something was moving in the shadows just beyond my reach. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my legs weaken beneath me. For a moment, I thought about running, about leaving the warehouse altogether. But the thought of going out into the dark alone was even more terrifying. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried down the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, and I scanned the warehouse, searching for any sign of what was causing the noise. But there was nothing. Just rows and rows of boxes, crates, and machinery. The place was empty, just like it had always been. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It was unlike any shadow I had seen before. It was tall, stretched out against the far wall, and it seemed to move of its own accord, undulating like smoke in the dim light. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, my body frozen in place. The shadow seemed to grow larger, its edges becoming more defined. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I didn't wait. I ran. My pulse was racing as I sprinted through the aisles, my mind filled with fear and confusion. What the hell was going on? I reached the front office in a panic, gasping for breath. Ben and Jim were still there, sitting at their desks, though their faces were twisted in confusion at my frantic entrance. "You okay, man?" Ben asked, his brow furrowed. I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain what I had just seen? How could I put into words the fear that was coursing through my veins? There's something in the warehouse," I stammered. "I saw it. It was a shadow, but not like anything I've ever seen." Jim raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "What do you mean? Just a shadow? Like from the lights?" "No, Jim," I snapped. "It wasn't like that. This thing moved on its own, like it was alive." The two of them exchanged a look, and for a moment, I felt like I was going crazy. "You sure you're not just tired?" Ben asked. "You've been working a lot of late shifts, man." I shook my head, feeling a surge of frustration. "No, it's not that. Something's happening in there. Something's wrong with the warehouse." There was a long silence before Ben sighed, rubbing his eyes. All right. We'll go check it out together. If it makes you feel better, we'll go. But I think you're just overworked, man. You need a break." We headed back to the warehouse, though I could tell that neither Ben nor Jim took me seriously. They joked as we walked, but their voices had an edge to them, as if they were trying to convince themselves as much as me that everything was fine. As we entered the warehouse, the air felt different, colder. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We walked through the aisles, the sound of our footsteps reverberating in the empty space. The warehouse seemed even more oppressive in the dark, the walls closing in around us. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of old wood and rust lingered in the background. I kept my flashlight trained on the shadows, scanning every corner. But there was nothing, just silence. Ben and Jim seemed relaxed, talking among themselves, though I could tell they were both uneasy. They were trying to act normal, trying to reassure themselves that everything was fine. I couldn't help but notice that their voices were getting quieter, their footsteps slower. It was as if they, too, were starting to feel it, the presence in the air, the oppressive weight of whatever was watching us. Then it happened. A loud bang echoed through the warehouse, so sharp and sudden that it made us all jump. The sound came from somewhere deep within the building, a heavy thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping across the floor. My heart leapt into my throat, and I could feel my hands shaking as I tightened my grip on the flashlight. The three of us stood frozen for a moment, the silence stretching out, thick and suffocating. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ben and Jim both nodded, their faces pale. "Yeah," Ben muttered. "That came from the back. Let's check it out." We walked toward the sound, the noise growing louder as we approached. The closer we got, the colder the air became, and I could feel the dread settling in my chest. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it. There, at the far end of the warehouse, was a figure. It was standing motionless in the darkness, facing us. Its shape was blurry, like it was made of smoke, its edges rippling and shifting in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, its eyes boring into us. "Who's there?" Ben called out, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and authority. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned, the air around it seeming to ripple. The silence was deafening as the figure moved toward us, its shape becoming clearer. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It wasn't human. Whatever it wasn't something from this world. Without warning, it lunged. A scream tore from my throat as I stumbled backward, my body colliding with the ground. Jim and Ben weren't far behind, their panic evident as they turned to flee. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its energy suffocating, like it was pulling all the light from the room. The last thing I saw before I ran was its face, or what could be called a face. It was a hollow, empty void, a black abyss where eyes should have been. I could feel its cold gaze on me as I scrambled to my feet, running toward the door, desperate to escape. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The warehouse loomed behind us, dark and silent once again. But the terror I felt that night stayed with me. The figure, the darkness, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something much worse. And I knew, deep down, that the warehouse held more secrets than I could ever understand. We stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of the experience hanging over us. Ben, Jim, and I had just witnessed something that none of us could explain, and none of us would ever forget. The days that followed were a blur. Each one felt like an eternity, stretching on forever as the tension in the warehouse continued to build. The strange occurrences hadn't stopped, but they had only become more frequent and more intense. The scraping noises became a near constant presence, echoing through the empty halls, always just behind me, as if something or someone was always lurking just out of sight. The shadow, that dark figure I had seen, seemed to have become a regular part of the warehouse. It was as though it was aware of me, and whenever I turned my back, I would feel it again, its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight in the air. Sometimes I could hear footsteps following me, slow and deliberate, always just at the edge of my hearing. When I would turn, there was nothing. But the feeling remained, that constant gnawing sensation that I wasn't alone. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The unease had turned into outright fear, a gnawing terror that followed me home at night and kept me up, wondering if I would make it through another shift. Ben and Jim had dismissed my concerns as nothing more than the result of working in an old, poorly lit building, but I knew better. Something wasn't right. Then, one night, it happened. I was alone in the warehouse, working late to finish an order that had come in unexpectedly. The rest of the staff had long since left, and the warehouse was still, quiet except for the hum of the lights overhead. I had just moved a stack of boxes when I heard another scrape, but this time, it was louder, sharper, almost as if whatever was making the sound was right behind me. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but the aisle was empty. Nothing. The silence was deafening. I stood frozen, listening. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The shadow, it was in the far corner of the warehouse, just like before, but this time it was closer. The darkness seemed to pulse and shift, and I could feel my stomach churn with dread. I couldn't just stand there any longer. I had to know what was going on, what was causing this, what had been causing it for days now. My legs moved of their own accord, bringing me closer to the shadow, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and run. As I stepped closer, I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I held it in front of me. The beam of light flickered once, then steadied as it illuminated the corner where the shadow had been. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. At first, I thought it was a person. A figure stood there, its form indistinct, as though the darkness itself had taken shape. But then I saw it more clearly, and my blood ran cold. The figure was wrong. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. The shape twisted, as if it were made of smoke or shadow, a dark silhouette that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was vaguely human in shape, but the edges were distorted, like something trying to be something it wasn't. Its presence filled the room, suffocating me, making it hard to breathe. The air grew thick with a musty, decaying smell, like wet earth or something rotting. I gagged, but couldn't tear my eyes away. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. My mind screamed for me to run, to get out of the warehouse and never come back, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body paralyzed by fear. I couldn't look away from the figure or whatever it was. It was as though it was drawing me in, calling to me with an invisible force. Then, it moved. The shadow took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, its form shifting with each movement. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the air seemed to grow even colder. The temperature in the warehouse dropped, and I could see my breath mist in front of me. My body began to tremble uncontrollably, and I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was trapped in the grip of terror. The shadow stepped forward again, and this time I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the floor, the sound of my frantic footsteps echoing through the warehouse as I bolted toward the exit. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut in front of me with a force that shook the entire building. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I turned and looked around, my breath ragged, my mind racing. The shadow had disappeared, but the sense of dread still hung heavy in the air. I felt it then, something cold, icy, pressing against the back of my neck. I didn't need to turn around to know that it was there. It was too close. I could feel its presence, its dark energy seeping into my skin, crawling beneath it. The light above flickered, casting long, ominous shadows across the walls. And then I heard a voice. It was low, almost a growl, but distinct enough for me to hear the words. "You shouldn't be here." The voice wasn't human. It was deep, like it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. It reverberated in my bones, sending a shock of terror straight through me. I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew one thing. Whatever it was real, and it was not going to let me leave. With a final, desperate effort, I pulled on the door again, and this time, it gave way. The door flew open, and I rushed out of the warehouse, stumbling into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I didn't care what I left behind. I just needed to get away. I ran all the way to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't stop until I was far from the warehouse, driving as fast as I could, heart pounding in my chest. The image of the shadow burned into my mind. The next day, I went back to the warehouse to confront Ben and Jim to tell them what had happened. But when I arrived, the warehouse was locked up tight. The lights were off, and the front office was empty. No one was there. I waited, but no one came. I called their phones, but both of them went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but the result was the same. The warehouse felt abandoned. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall, where I had seen the shadow, there were marks. Deep, dark gouges, like something had scratched at the walls, desperately trying to escape. I ran my fingers over them, my breath catching in my throat. There was something written, something carved into the wall in a strange, jagged script. Leave now, before it's too late. I don't know what happened to Ben or Jim. I don't know if they ever came back, but I never set foot in that warehouse again. Some things are better left undisturbed. And now, I can't help but wonder, what if I hadn't run? What if I'd stayed, tried to confront whatever was lurking in that darkness? Would I have ever walked out again? I don't have the answers. All I know is that the warehouse is empty now, but every so often, when the night is still and quiet, I feel something like eyes watching me from the darkness. And I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. As the days dragged on, the eerie occurrences continued to build. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the shadows, noises, and feelings of being watched were nothing more than a trick of the mind's stress and isolation manifesting in dark corners of the warehouse. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. I still remember the night everything came to a head. The silence of the warehouse was suffocating, a thick, oppressive quiet that seemed to weigh down on me as I walked through the aisles. I could hear my own breathing, steady but fast, as though my body was bracing for something, though I didn't know what. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the rows of boxes, making the darkness seem all the more alive. That night, I wasn't alone in the warehouse. I had convinced Ben and Jim to stay late with me. After all, the strange events had only escalated, and it didn't feel right to be there by myself anymore. They hadn't seen anything, but they couldn't deny that something was off. Still, they tried to chalk it up to the isolation, the tiredness, the weird quirks of an old building. But the more we talked, the more convinced I became that something else was at play. The air felt different that night, thicker somehow. It was as if the warehouse itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The usual hum of the ventilation system had stopped, leaving behind an unnerving stillness. Every step we took seemed louder than it should have been, the sound of our boots against the concrete floor echoing unnaturally. Then we heard it. A sound, like a dragging footstep, echoed through the warehouse, followed by a loud bang. It was unmistakable, and all three of us froze. I could feel my heart racing, pounding in my chest as the noise continued, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the back of the warehouse, from the very area where I'd seen the shadow days before. "We have to check it out," I said, my voice barely a whisper, thick with fear. Ben, typically the more level-headed one, looked hesitant. "I don't know, man. This doesn't feel right." But Jim, who had been silent up until now, nodded toward the back. "Let's just see what it is. We can't just ignore it." The three of us slowly made our way to the back, our footsteps cautious, our breaths shallow. The flashlight beams darted across the darkened space, illuminating the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. We reached the farthest aisle, where the noise had originated, and stopped dead in our tracks. There, standing in the middle of the aisle, was a figure. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way we understood it. It was a shape tall, shifting, almost liquid-like, as though it didn't belong in the physical world. It shimmered, its edges blurring and distorting in the dim light, and I couldn't look away. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, in the middle of the warehouse, watching us. My throat went dry as I tried to force words out, but they wouldn't come. Ben reached for the flashlight, his hand trembling as he aimed the beam at the figure, but the light flickered and went out. The shadows swallowed us whole, and then the figure stepped forward. It moved in a way that wasn't natural, as if it were gliding, floating just above the ground. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stare in horror as it closed the distance between us. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and flee, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. unable to break free from its gaze. Suddenly, the figure spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was cold, hollow, and devoid of any warmth. "You shouldn't be here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I staggered back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Ben and Jim were in shock, their faces pale as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Before we could react, the figure lunged at us. It wasn't quick, but its movement was swift enough to send a shock of panic coursing through my veins. Ben stumbled backward, and Jim shoved me out of the way, pulling me into a run. We didn't stop to look behind us, we just ran, not knowing if we were being chased or if it was even real. We reached the front office and slammed the door behind us, our hearts pounding in our chests, our hands shaking. For a long time, none of us spoke. The silence was deafening, and all we could do was try to make sense of what we had just experienced. We had seen something that didn't belong. "We need to leave," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "This place is cursed." Ben looked at me, his face pale, his lips tight. He didn't argue. He knew what we had seen, and he knew there was no logical explanation for it. Jim nodded, his face ashen, and without another word, we grabbed our things and fled the warehouse, never looking back. We never spoke about what happened again. We tried to forget it, but the memory lingered, haunting us in ways we couldn't escape. We all went on with our lives, but something had shifted. The world seemed different, darker, as though we had touched something beyond our understanding. As for the warehouse, it was abandoned shortly after we left. No one ever spoke about it again, and the company eventually sold the property to someone else. The new owners began renovations, but the workers who were hired to fix up the place quickly quit. No one stayed long, and the building was left standing, hollow and empty, waiting. I never went back. None of us did. And I don't know if I ever will. Somewhere in the shadows of that warehouse, something still waits. And I wonder if anyone else will ever have the misfortune of uncovering what's hidden within. The memory of that night lingers, a chill that never quite fades. And though I've tried to move on, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of my perception. It all started one late autumn evening, when my friends and I decided to take a break from the usual grind and do something different. We were young, in our early 20s, filled with the energy of a generation constantly on the lookout for adventure. My name is Daniel, and I had always been the one to suggest new ideas, to find an escape from routine. On that particular evening, my friends Mark, Ben, and I found ourselves sitting in the living room of our apartment, our eyes glued to the clock. It was around 10 p.m., and we had just finished another round of video games. The night had felt somewhat ordinary, but I wasn't ready for the night to end. I needed something else. "You guys ever hear about that old hospital just outside of town?" I asked, breaking the silence. It wasn't the first time the subject had come up, but this time it felt different. My voice had a certain edge to it. Perhaps I was just tired of the usual. Perhaps I was craving something that would break up the monotony. Mark leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "You mean the one that closed down in the 80s? I've heard it's haunted." He sounded skeptical, but there was a slight hint of curiosity in his tone. I chuckled. "Haunted? I don't know, man. But I've read some creepy stuff online about it. People say they hear strange noises, see shadows moving, stuff like that." Ben, who had been half listening until then, turned his head toward me, his interest piqued. "Wait, people actually went there?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's been abandoned for decades, but a few people have snuck in over the years. You know, the usual thrill seekers and urban explorers." Ben sat back, crossing his arms. "Seems like one of those things you hear about, but never actually check out, right?" I could feel the excitement building inside me. "What if we went? Just to see what's really up there? I mean, it could be fun." Mark shook his head. "Man, you know we've got a lot going on, and I'm not sure about wandering into an old hospital at midnight." The others hesitated, but I could tell the idea was starting to take root in their minds. Mark was always the one to second-guess plans, but Ben seemed more willing to entertain the idea. The more I talked about it, the more the idea of visiting the old hospital seemed enticing, almost like a rite of passage, a chance to break free from our usual routine, to experience something outside our comfort zones. The conversation carried on with more back and forth, until, finally, the decision was made. Mark reluctantly agreed, though he kept grumbling about how stupid the whole thing was. Ben was all in, and before I knew it, we were gearing up for the adventure. It's funny how those moments when something seems so trivial turn out to be the start of something bigger. None of us knew what we were truly getting into. The details were hazy, as they often are when we're talking about places like this. Abandoned hospitals, old factories, anything left to decay in a forgotten corner of the world. They all have this allure, a pull that calls out to the brave, the foolish, or the curious. We were a bit of all three that night. We gathered our things and set out, not knowing what we were walking into. The air outside was chilly, that sharp bite of autumn creeping into the early morning hours. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement, mixed with a bit of doubt. It wasn't a typical night out with friends. It felt different. The road to the hospital was quieter than usual. The streetlights flickered above us as we drove in my old car, which groaned with every bump in the road. The town, which usually felt alive with the noise of late-night traffic, felt eerily still. I remember looking out of the window as we drove through the empty streets, seeing houses with lights off, the occasional figure passing by, but nothing more. As we approached the outskirts of town, the usual hustle and bustle seemed like a distant memory. It was as if the world had slowed down to watch what we were about to do. After a short drive through narrow, winding streets, we arrived at the hospital. I could barely make out the outline of the building in the dim moonlight, its silhouette dark against the backdrop of trees. The hospital loomed ahead like a giant forgotten by time. A single road led to the entrance, flanked by rusted gates, their bars twisted and bent from years of neglect. We parked the car at the edge of the property, the engine still running as we sat there in silence. "Do we really want to do this?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. I looked over at him. His face was pale, and I could see the unease in his eyes. He wasn't one to easily back down, but the thought of stepping into a place with such a dark history seemed to have him rattled. I understood his hesitation, but there was no turning back now. "Come on, let's just check it out. If it's too much, we leave." I wasn't even sure if I believed my own words, but I had to say something to keep us going. With a collective sigh, we stepped out of the car and made our way toward the entrance. Each step I took toward the old building felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was resisting our approach. The air around us felt colder as we crossed the threshold, the crunch of gravel beneath our boots, the only sound in the otherwise quiet night. We were about to walk into a place where years of decay and abandonment had left their mark, and we had no idea what we would find inside. But we had crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. As we reached the rusted doors of the hospital, I felt my heart race. The hospital was abandoned, yes, but there was something else about it, something that told me we weren't alone. We had no idea then how right I would be. The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It wasn't just the coldness of the building itself, but something else, something heavier that seemed to settle around us. The walls, dark and worn with years of neglect, seemed to watch us as we made our way down the long corridor. The dim light of our flashlights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The silence was thick, pressing against us like a weight. At first, it didn't seem that strange. After all, it was an old hospital. Hospitals, by their very nature, have an eerie, sterile atmosphere, and the lack of activity gave the place an unsettling quietness. But there was something more to this place. I remember hearing the sound first faint, almost like the rustling of fabric. It was distant, coming from somewhere deeper within the hospital, but it was there. Mark, who had been walking ahead of us, froze in place, his head tilting slightly as if trying to make sense of the noise. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. We all paused, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was impossible to pinpoint where the sound came from. It could have been the wind, the building settling, or something more. "Maybe it's just the old pipes or something," Ben suggested, though his voice wavered just a little. He was always the brave one, but even he seemed unnerved by the atmosphere. "Could be," I said, trying to sound casual, though I didn't entirely believe it myself. The building didn't just feel abandoned, it felt alive. as though it had a pulse of its own, waiting to be disturbed. The thought was unsettling. We continued deeper into the hospital, the narrow hallway stretching out before us like a maze of empty rooms and forgotten corridors. It was the kind of place where every step echoed, a constant reminder that we were intruders in a space that had long since been left to rot. But the eerie sensation that had settled over us wouldn't go away. As we walked further, the flickering of our flashlights became more pronounced. Each time the light stuttered, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift. Mark was in front now, leading the way, his flashlight slicing through the darkness ahead of us. Suddenly, the beam of his light flickered out entirely, leaving us in complete darkness for a heartbeat. "Damn it, not now," Mark muttered, trying to shake the flashlight. He turned it back on, but the beam was weak, barely illuminating the ground beneath his feet. It was as if the flashlight itself had been drained of power, like it was suddenly less reliable than it had been before. "Maybe the batteries are going out," I offered, though it didn't seem like the right explanation. We had just put fresh batteries in before we left. "Great," Ben said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We're in an abandoned hospital, and now our lights are going out. This is exactly why I didn't want to come." Mark ignored him, moving ahead with what seemed like a renewed urgency. "Let's just get to the end of the hall, maybe find a power box or something." But that's when it happened. We heard it again. The rustling sound. This time, it was much closer. A quick, sharp noise, like the sound of something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I wasn't imagining it. We all heard it coming from the room on the left. "What the hell was that?" Ben whispered, his voice low but filled with tension. Mark, looking slightly pale now, turned to us. "It's nothing. Probably just a rat or something." But none of us believed it. Rats don't sound like that. They don't drag things across the floor. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine as the air in the hallway seemed to grow even colder, more suffocating. We all looked at each other, but none of us made a move to investigate. We just stood there, caught in the moment, wondering what the hell was going on. "Maybe we should go back," Mark suggested, his voice more cautious than before. "This place is starting to feel off." We had all been nervous when we first arrived, but now it felt like something much darker was hanging over us. The strange noises, the flickering lights, the sudden drop in temperature, it was as if the hospital had become more than just an abandoned building. It felt like it was alive, aware of our presence, and it didn't want us there. "No," I said, trying to shake off the unease that was quickly creeping up on me. "We're already here. Let's at least check out one of the rooms. Maybe it's nothing." We made our way toward the door from where the sound had come. As we neared it, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, as though it had been opened recently. But that didn't make sense. No one had been here in years. The building had been sealed shut by the city when it closed, and no one had managed to get in since. At least, that's what we had heard. "Should we open it?" Ben asked, his voice barely audible. He sounded less sure than before. Mark didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the door. It was like he was trying to decide whether to move forward or turn back. The atmosphere was thick with tension. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "I'll do it," I said, stepping forward. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't let them see that. I reached out and grabbed the door handle, pulling it open slowly. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the hallway. I expected to see dust and cobwebs, the usual signs of neglect. But instead, what I saw in the dim light of our flashlights made my stomach lurch. The room was empty, save for a small pile of what looked like old, tattered sheets in the corner. But the real shock came when I looked closer. The floor was covered in strange, dark stains, as though something had been spilled smeared across the tiles. My breath caught in my throat. It looked like blood, but I couldn't be sure. "What the hell is that?" Mark muttered, his voice full of disgust. He stepped back from the doorway, his face pale. Ben looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Are we really going to stay here?" I stood frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The atmosphere in the room felt wrong, charged with something dark and oppressive. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I looked back toward the hallway. The air felt thicker, the silence louder. Something wasn't right. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around in a panic, my heart hammering in my chest. The door had been opened just a second ago. There was no way it could have closed by itself. We all stood in stunned silence for a moment before Ben, looking more terrified than I'd ever seen him, turned and bolted down the hallway. "Get out of here! Now!" he yelled. Panic spread like wildfire, and the three of us followed, racing down the dark corridor. My thoughts were jumbled, my heart pounding, but one thing was clear. We were no longer welcome here. As we ran, I looked back just once, and that's when I saw it. The faintest shadow, lingering just beyond the flicker of our flashlight, moving along the walls as if it were following us. We didn't stop until we reached the entrance, and even then, the chill didn't leave us. But there was no way we were going back in that night. Whatever we had just experienced, it wasn't a coincidence. We tried to forget about what had happened in that room, but the weight of it stayed with us. That feeling, like a shadow at the edge of our vision, never truly left. The way the door slammed shut, the smell of something foul in the air, the dark stains on the floor, it all gnawed at us, a constant reminder of how wrong things felt. The next day, we made an attempt to brush it off. We were all exhausted from the fear, but there was something in the back of my mind that told me we hadn't seen the worst of it yet. I knew it was silly, but a part of me kept thinking that if we just went back and investigated more, we'd find some logical explanation. Maybe it was just the decay of the building, or the way the old wood creaked and groaned under pressure. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. "I'm not going back in there," Mark had said that morning, his voice still heavy with dread. He was trying to act tough, but I could see it in his eyes. The fear was still there. "That place is messed up. We've got to let it go." I wanted to agree with him. I should have agreed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were so close to understanding what was going on. Ben seemed more determined than ever, though. His curiosity was too strong to be easily dismissed. "We can't just leave it like this," Ben insisted, pacing back and forth. "Something's going on in that hospital. And I don't think it's just the building being old and falling apart." It took some convincing, but by midday, we had gathered the courage to return. As soon as we walked through the entrance again, a sense of dread enveloped me. The place looked even worse, and the daylight shadows clung to the corners of every room, and the once white walls were now stained with grime and mold. The smell, a mixture of mildew and something sour, was stronger than before. We made our way through the building slowly, trying to be quiet. The air felt thick, like it was trying to suffocate us. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence, as though the hospital was listening, watching. The first thing we noticed as we moved deeper into the building was the temperature. It had been chilly the night before, but today it felt unbearable. A biting cold clung to the air, making our breath visible in the dim light. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd expect from an abandoned place, especially one in the middle of the summer. There was no breeze, no reason for it, and yet it was there, pressing in on us. "What the hell is going on with this place?" Mark muttered, rubbing his arms to try and warm up. "This is seriously messed up." I was starting to feel the same way. The building wasn't just abandoned, it was deteriorating, but there was more to it. The silence was too deep, too absolute. Every creak and groan of the structure seemed amplified, like the walls were trying to speak, trying to tell us something. As we walked through the corridors, the flickering light from our flashlights seemed to get worse. One by one, they began to fail, each of us having to repeatedly tap them to get the beam to stay steady. But every time, the light grew weaker, the darkness swallowing it whole. It was as if the hospital was draining the light from us, leaving us in a deeper, colder void with each passing minute. But it was the sounds that started to grow more frequent, more unsettling. First, it was the occasional thud from down the hall. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, following us from just out of sight. Each time we turned around, we saw nothing. No one. Just the empty, decaying space. Ben was the first to break the silence. "I'm not messing around anymore," he said, his voice tense. "There's something in here. Something. Alive." He wasn't wrong. I could feel it too. We weren't alone. Something was here with us. But what was it? And why was it so intent on making us feel like we were intruding on its territory? "I think we need to go back to the room," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why I suggested it, but it felt like we needed to understand what had happened there. Maybe we could find an explanation for the strange events, or maybe we were just grasping at straws. Either way, something told me we couldn't leave until we knew. Mark hesitated, but he didn't protest. He was just as curious as I was, even though fear had begun to creep into his bones. We made our way back to the room we had found the day before, the one with the dark stains on the floor. It felt like an eternity before we reached the door. It was still slightly ajar, and the faintest light from our flashlights made the room look even more unsettling. The air inside was cold, colder than the rest of the building, and as we stepped inside, the silence hit us like a wave. The room was just as we had left it, empty and decayed, but now there was a new feeling in the air, something even more suffocating. And then I saw it. On the floor, near the corner, where the stains had been, there was something different. A faint outline, almost like a shape, as though something had been dragged through the spot again. But this time, there was something darker, more defined. I knelt down to get a closer look, but as I did, a cold gust of winds blew through the room, sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the cold air. It felt like the wind itself was alive, like it was moving with purpose. It had a weight to it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was pushing us towards something we weren't ready for. "What is that?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. He had moved closer behind me, but he didn't want to get too close either. I reached out to touch the dark shape on the floor, but as my fingers made contact, I immediately felt a jolt of coldness shoot up my arm. It wasn't just cold, it was freezing, as if I had touched something frozen to the core. I yanked my hand back in alarm, but it was too late. From somewhere deep in the building, we heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl, followed by a faint scraping noise. It was like something was moving in the walls, creeping closer. "That's it. We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice laced with panic. He turned and bolted for the door, but I couldn't move. Something was holding me in place. Something invisible, but powerful, that made it impossible for me to leave. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the growling stopped. The air grew even colder, and the lights flickered once more. A moment of silence passed, heavy and suffocating, before the door to the room slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We didn't even think. We ran. I had never felt fear like that before. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you watch a scary movie or hear a creak in the floorboards at night. No, this was something much deeper. Something primal. It was the fear of the unknown, the terror that comes when you realize that the world around you is no longer what you thought it was. We had barely made it down the hallway when the door to the room slammed shut behind us. It echoed through the empty building like a gunshot. The sound lingered in the air, thick and oppressive, as though the hospital itself was warning us to leave. But we couldn't go back. Not after what we had just seen. The fear was already creeping in, but when I turned to look back at Ben and Mark, I saw that their faces were as pale as mine. They had stopped running, their breath coming in shallow gasps. I could see the panic in their eyes. Something had changed. We weren't just dealing with a creepy, abandoned building anymore. No, whatever was in this place, whatever we had just encountered was real, and it was closing in on us. Something's in here with us, Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. He was shaking now, his hands trembling at his sides. "We need to get out," Ben said, his voice cracking. "We should have never come back." I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was right. I could feel it, the weight of something malevolent surrounding us, watching us from the shadows. I had seen enough, and I knew it was time to leave. But as I turned toward the exit, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was quick, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't move. The air around us grew heavier, more suffocating. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in front of me. But this wasn't just cold. It was unnatural, almost as if the building itself was exhaling its final breath. The growling sound we had heard earlier returned, louder this time, and it was no longer distant. It was close. Too close. Run! I screamed. But as I turned to push past Ben, I saw it. From the darkness of the hallway, something was emerging, something large, something inhuman. It wasn't like anything I had seen before. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was a silhouette, darker than the shadows themselves, and it moved with an unnatural speed, gliding across the floor like a predator stalking its prey. I could hear its footsteps now, slow, deliberate, heavy with purpose. Every step it took seemed to echo in the air, vibrating through the walls, vibrating in my chest. I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of it. And then, its eyes. Those eyes. They weren't human. They weren't even animal. They were something else. The darkness of its body seemed to recede for just a moment, revealing two burning, blood-red eyes that glowed with an intensity I couldn't describe. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They stared directly at me, and I could feel that its gaze was seeping into my soul, freezing me from the inside out. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as though the presence in front of me had some kind of control over my body. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. I looked to Ben and Mark. They were just as terrified. They too were rooted to the spot, their eyes wide in shock and fear. Mark was muttering something under his breath, his hands pressed to his ears as though trying to block out the sound of whatever was coming. Ben was shaking, his flashlight flickering uncontrollably, casting eerie shadows across the walls. But neither of them moved. Not a single step. And then, the creature, or whatever it was, took a step closer. It wasn't walking anymore. It was gliding, its limbs moving unnaturally, as though it was being pulled by invisible strings. The growling sound became louder, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. And then, it spoke. Or at least, it seemed to. But it wasn't a voice. Not a human voice. It was a sound, a whisper, or perhaps a scream, but it didn't come from its mouth. It came from the walls, from the very air itself, as though the building was speaking through it. It was a noise I couldn't understand, something so primal and raw that it seemed to bypass language altogether. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my feet felt cemented to the ground. My body was trapped in a vice of terror, and all I could do was stare into those eyes. It took another step forward. And then, without warning, the world around me seemed to shift. The hospital, the walls, the ceiling, they all began to twist, to warp. The floor beneath me seemed to ripple, as though the building itself was alive and angry. The room was no longer the room we had entered. It had transformed into something else, something darker, something that didn't belong in our world. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Out of the shadows, more of them emerged. Figures crawling from the dark corners of the room. They were twisted, malformed, their bodies bent at unnatural angles, and their faces, if you could even call them faces, were blank slates of smooth, pale skin. Their eyes, like those of the first creature, were glowing. But now there were too many to count. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the creatures surrounded us, their eyes locked on us, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were closing in for the kill. I couldn't even scream. My mouth felt dry, my throat closing up, and my heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. Ben's voice broke through the panic, barely audible. "We need to get out of here. Now." He was moving now, pulling at Mark's arm, trying to break the spell that had us all trapped. I managed to tear my eyes away from the creatures and force myself to move. My body was still frozen with fear, but I willed my legs to move, to run, to get out of that place before it swallowed us whole. We bolted for the exit, not daring to look back. I could hear the creatures behind us, their footsteps echoing, their growls growing louder with each passing second. But we didn't stop. We didn't stop running until we were outside, until the cold night air hit us and the darkness of the hospital loomed behind us. But even then, I could still feel it. That presence, those eyes, and I knew we hadn't escaped. We didn't speak. Not for a long while. As we stood there, breathless and wide-eyed, the abandoned hospital loomed in the distance, its dark windows like empty, watching eyes. The moonlight barely touched its crumbling facade, leaving it as a silhouette against the sky, a jagged reminder of the horrors we had just escaped. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but the adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving me feeling weak, drained. My legs shook, my throat was dry, and my head was spinning. We had made it out, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not by any means. We had barely escaped with our lives, and even now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us, watching us. "We need to go," Ben said, his voice flat. He was staring at the ground, his face pale. He wasn't looking at the hospital anymore, but I could feel the weight of his fear hanging in the air. It was the same for all of us. We had been in that place long enough to understand. Whatever was there, whatever we had encountered, it wasn't something that could be left behind. It would follow us. Always. But as much as I wanted to leave, to run as far away from that place as possible, I couldn't bring myself to take another step. I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "How could this be real? What was that thing? The creatures, the walls? This place wasn't just abandoned. It was something else." Mark shook his head, his eyes still wide with disbelief. "It wasn't just the building. It wasn't just the ghosts of people who used to live there. Something else was in there. Something. Alive. Alive!" The word echoed in my mind, clashing with every rational thought I tried to hold on to. Alive? It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. But as I thought about it, I realized that the creatures, those things, weren't just figments of our imagination. They were real. They were tangible. They had been in the hospital. They had been moving around us, watching us, waiting for us to find them. That thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I took an involuntary step backward. I could still feel the cold breath on my neck. I could still hear the growls. And those eyes, those glowing red eyes, they hadn't disappeared. They were burned into my memory, and I knew they would haunt me for the rest of my life. "We can't just go back there," Ben said, his voice urgent. "We can't go back. No one else can. We've seen it. We know what's inside. And we can't let anyone else suffer the way we did." I turned to look at him, and I saw the same fear in his eyes that I felt in mine. We all understood, but it wasn't that simple. What happened inside that hospital, what we saw, what we experienced, it wasn't something we could just forget. We couldn't ignore it. But there was a part of me, deep down, that was still trying to make sense of it. I wanted to believe that there was a logical explanation for everything. I wanted to believe that we had just imagined it, that we had let our fear get the best of us. But I couldn't. Not after everything we had witnessed. We turned and started walking, though we had no idea where to go, no destination in mind. The night felt colder now, the air thicker, as if the world itself had shifted somehow, had changed in some irreversible way. The feeling of unease wasn't leaving us. It was settling in, spreading through our bones, making it hard to breathe. The streets we walked down were empty. No cars, no lights, no sounds. It was like the world had gone silent. There was a weight to the silence, a pressure in the air that made every step feel heavier, like we were being watched by unseen eyes. "We need to tell someone," Mark said suddenly, breaking the silence. He was looking at the ground as he walked, his voice strained. "We can't just walk away from this. We can't pretend it didn't happen." I nodded, but the thought of telling anyone made my stomach turn. Who would believe us? Who would listen to a story about ghosts, creatures, and a hospital that felt alive in ways that defied explanation? We had no proof, no evidence, just our word, and that wasn't going to be enough. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I wasn't sure how we would. I was just trying to reassure myself, trying to calm the storm that raged inside me. But as I spoke, I felt something cold, something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Ben and Mark didn't notice at first. They kept walking ahead, but I could feel it. The air had changed again. It was heavier, thicker, and I could feel it pressing down on me, closing in around me. Something was watching us. "Guys," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, "we're not alone." They both turned to me, their faces a mix of confusion and concern, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't have words for it. I didn't need them. I could feel it, that cold, suffocating presence behind us, like something was just waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice tense. "Now." And just like that, the night felt even darker, even colder. It was as though the shadows themselves were creeping in, closing around us. We quickened our pace, moving faster, but no matter how fast we walked, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. We reached the car and climbed inside, each of us silent as we drove away from that place. As we passed the turnoff for the hospital, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart skipping a beat. The building was still there, silent, empty, but I could have sworn I saw something moving in the window, something staring back at us. And it wasn't human. We didn't speak much after we left. The silence in the car was deafening, but the weight of our thoughts filled the air in a way that words couldn't. The radio stayed off, the windows rolled up, and the miles stretched on, each one bringing us further away from the abandoned hospital. But no matter how far we drove, no matter how many turns we made, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place wasn't finished with us yet. That night, I barely slept. The shadows in my room seemed darker than usual. The creaks of the house felt louder, and every sound in the distance sent my heart racing. It was as if I could still feel the cold breath on the back of my neck, or hear those eerie growls reverberating in the pit of my stomach. The memory of the hospital, the creatures, and that feeling of being hunted, it all stayed with me long after I had locked the door to my room and turned off the lights. Ben and Mark tried to reach out the next day. They both sent me texts, their messages full of uncertainty, their words broken, like they were still piecing together what had happened. We all had our own way of coping, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to erase what we had gone through, what we had seen. The days went by slowly, dragging on in a haze of exhaustion, but the unease never fully left. Every time I closed my eyes, the images from that night came rushing back. The walls of the hospital that seemed to breathe, the creatures that moved too fast, and the eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes. No matter how hard I tried to shake them, they were there, lurking behind my eyelids, in the corners of my mind. I didn't go back to the hospital, and I didn't tell anyone else about what happened either. Who would believe me? Who would believe us? A group of friends venturing into an abandoned building, finding nothing but dust and decay, and then suddenly facing things that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. But the truth was, we weren't the same people we had been before that night. The experience had changed us, fractured something deep inside of us. We were all haunted by it in different ways, and though we never spoke of it again, I could feel the unspoken words between us whenever we were in the same room. Years have passed since that night, and I can't say I've completely moved on. Every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something, some shadow that doesn't quite fit, a cold draft where there shouldn't be one, a noise that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and for a moment, I wonder if it's still there, if it's still watching us, waiting for us to return. I still drive past the hospital sometimes. I'll be on my way to work or out running errands, and there it is, sitting on the edge of town like an open wound, its dark windows reflecting the passing cars like empty eyes. I don't stop anymore. I don't slow down. I've learned that some places are better left in the past, left to rot in the corners of our memories where they belong. But there are nights when the world is quiet and the moon is full that I'll lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I'll feel that same unease creeping back, that feeling that something is watching me, that something is waiting for the right moment to return. And for a brief, terrifying instant, I'll wonder if it ever really left. This story began not with a feeling of dread or anxiety, but with the kind of hope you only get when you start something new. The excitement of new beginnings, the anticipation of what's to come, and the feeling that everything is going to be perfect, at least for a while. My name's David. I'm just an average guy, really. I work a regular 9-to-5 job, and in the evenings, I enjoy the quiet moments with my thoughts, maybe watch a movie or read a book. Up until a few years ago, I was renting an apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a terrible place, but it had its share of problems: leaky faucets, noisy neighbors, and drafty windows that never quite kept the cold out during winter. I had been thinking for a while about making a change, not just with where I lived, but with everything. It felt like time to take a step forward, to change things up a bit. That's when I found it, the house. It was a charming place, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. The kind of house that looked like it belonged in a postcard. It had that classic charm with an old-school touch. 2 stories, a garden that seemed to stretch out forever, and a few mature trees that shaded the house from the sun in the summer. When I first saw it, I knew this was the place. It was perfect, a peaceful sanctuary from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The fact that it was within my budget was nothing short of a miracle, and I couldn't believe my luck. I remember the first time I stepped inside. The air was fresh. The floors creaked with the kind of welcoming sound you expect from a house that's been around for a while. And the smell, oh, the smell of aged wood and dust that had settled in corners. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it felt almost nostalgic, like walking into an old memory that you hadn't yet experienced. There was something about it that felt right, like this place was made just for me. The moving process went smoothly, and after a couple of weeks, I found myself settling into my new home. I spent my days at work and my evenings unpacking, organizing, and getting the house just the way I wanted it. The living room, with its large windows, became my favorite spot. I'd sit there after dinner, enjoying a cup of coffee and watching the world pass by. The house had an old-fashioned charm, but it was far from perfect. There were a few things that needed some attention. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling, and there was a faint odor that lingered in the basement, but nothing I couldn't handle. As for the people around me, the neighbors, they were quiet, polite, but kept to themselves. It wasn't the sort of neighborhood where everyone gathers for BBQs or throws block parties, and that was fine with me. I liked the solitude. It gave me a chance to unwind after the stresses of work. For the first few months, life in the house was exactly what I had imagined. Peaceful, serene, and quiet. Nothing extraordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. It was as though this house and I had become one, both settling into a new rhythm together. But then, as with all stories, something started to change. A small thing at first, just a feeling, a slight discomfort that I couldn't quite place. It started with the doors. There were moments when I would be downstairs, working in the kitchen or watching TV, and I'd hear the sound of a door creaking open upstairs. At first, I shrugged it off. The house was old, after all. Old houses make noises, creaks, groans, and shifts in the foundation that can sound like something more. Still, the sound kept repeating. It wasn't constant, just occasional. A door opening when no one was around. At night, after I'd gone to bed, I could hear it sometimes. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The first time it happened, I told myself it was probably the wind, but it didn't take long for that explanation to wear thin. The house wasn't drafty enough to make doors open on their own, and the noises were never the same. Sometimes it would be the sound of a door opening slowly, and other times it would sound like something or someone was shuffling around upstairs. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. I was still getting used to the house, so I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe there was a problem with the hinges or the floors settling. But after a while, I began to notice something even stranger. It was the room. The room at the end of the upstairs hallway. I never paid it much attention before. It was a door like any other, closed and seemingly forgotten. But there was something about it that started to bug me. It was locked. I never thought much about it, at least not until I started hearing things from inside. You see, the sounds that came from the upstairs were one thing, but there was something odd about this particular door. At night, when I would hear those noises from the upper floors, they seemed to be coming from behind that door. It wasn't loud or disruptive, just a faint rustling, a tapping, almost like something was moving inside. But every time I checked, the door was still locked. I never could find the key either. There was no sign of it in the house, no key under the mat, no spare hanging on the hook. It was as though it had been intentionally hidden away. This wasn't just a locked room. Something about it seemed off. Something about that door felt like it was keeping more than just the outside world out. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind it was the reason for all those strange noises I'd been hearing. It's funny how we can get so used to things, only to have the smallest detail make us question everything we thought we knew. That door, and the room it led to was about to change everything for me. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. But as the days went on and the noises from the room became more frequent, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening. Something in that room. Something locked away. And soon, I was about to find out what. It wasn't much at first, the kind of thing you'd brush off as nothing more than a quirk of an old house. It wasn't until I started paying closer attention that I realized something wasn't quite right. In the weeks after I moved in, life had settled into a predictable rhythm, almost like I was living inside a daydream. Then, one evening, I sat on the couch in my living room, the room with the large windows that overlooked the quiet street outside. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first few stars were beginning to twinkle. Everything was still. I had been enjoying a rare moment of peace, the kind of quiet you only get when the world outside slows down and the weight of the day lifts off your shoulders. But then it happened. It was a slight movement, something so faint it could easily be dismissed. But I saw it. The curtain in the window near the front door fluttered. Just a small breeze, or so I thought. I got up to check the window, thinking maybe I had left it open a crack, but it was shut tight. No breeze. Nothing. And yet, the curtain had moved. I thought about it for a moment, shrugged it off, and returned to my seat. I was getting paranoid. This was just the house settling, right? A natural shift in the air currents. But then the doorbell rang. Now, I don't know if I can explain it properly, but there was something about that ring that felt off. Not a normal, friendly ring. It wasn't the kind of chime you'd expect from someone coming over for a visit. It was sharp, unnaturally loud, and seemed to echo through the house. My stomach dropped. I walked over to the door, expecting to find someone standing there. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone selling something. But when I opened it, there was no one. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of prank. A kid, messing around, ringing doorbells and running away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty porch. Nothing. I checked both sides of the front yard, but there was no one in sight. No cars parked out front, no footsteps in the gravel driveway. Nothing but the silence of the evening. I closed the door, more puzzled than worried. What was going on? Why did the bell ring like that? I hadn't even heard a car, and there was no way anyone could have run away so quickly. I dismissed it as an odd coincidence. Maybe the bell had just malfunctioned, or maybe I'd misheard it. But that wasn't the last strange thing that happened that night. Later, around midnight, I was heading to bed when I heard the sound of footsteps. Not the creaks and groans of the house settling, but actual footsteps, soft, deliberate, and close. I froze. I was alone. There was no one in the house but me, and yet the sound of steps echoed from upstairs. Slow and steady, they came from the hallway above, getting closer and closer to the stairs. At this point, I couldn't convince myself that it was the house shifting or some random noise from the pipes. I wasn't an idiot. I knew what I was hearing. But I told myself, it's fine. It's just the house. It's old. It makes noises. Still, the footsteps continued. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the staircase at the top of the hall, half expecting to see someone appear at the top. But there was nothing. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to walk up the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to move, determined to prove that there was nothing to worry about. I checked each room, the bathroom, and then the guest room. Empty. Nothing unusual. I stood in the hallway, my gaze drawn to the door at the end of the hall. The locked door. The one that I had been ignoring for weeks. The one that now, in the dead of night, felt like the center of everything. The footsteps had stopped. The house was silent once again, but the air around me felt thick. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like something was watching me from behind that door. I couldn't shake the feeling. My thoughts raced, and for a split second, I almost convinced myself that I should open that door. I should find out what was behind it. But I didn't. I went back downstairs, trying to rationalize the situation, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the wind again, the house settling, or maybe even the old pipes making noise. Whatever it was, I wasn't going to let it get to me. Still, there was no escaping the unease that had begun to settle in my chest. For the next few days, I kept my focus on my work, determined not to let the strange events get the best of me. But they didn't stop. They kept happening, one after another. It was the middle of the week when I got up in the morning, the sunlight streaming through the window as I went downstairs to make breakfast. The house was quiet, and the world outside was still, except for one thing. The door at the end of the hallway, the one I had avoided for weeks, was slightly ajar. I froze in the doorway of the kitchen. I had checked that door before going to bed, and it had been locked. I was certain of it. But now it was open. Just a crack, but enough to make my stomach churn. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. There was no way I could have left it open. I had checked. I was sure of it. I walked up the stairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the door, the faintest sound reached my ears. A soft, rustling noise, like paper being shuffled. I slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark, but it wasn't empty. In the far corner of the room was a chair, its back to me, but no one was sitting in it. And yet, the rustling continued. It wasn't loud, just a soft noise, but it was coming from somewhere in the room. I quickly scanned the space, but there was nothing to explain what I was hearing. The room was bare. The walls were dusty, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust, and the faintest smell of mildew hung in the air. No furniture, no signs of life. And yet, the rustling continued. I stepped inside, cautiously. I had to know what was making that sound. But just as I reached the center of the room, the door slammed shut behind me. The force of it shook the walls, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The rustling stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. There was something wrong here. Something I couldn't put my finger on. I turned and grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, the same way it had been when I first moved in. No key, no way to open it. I spent the next few minutes in a daze, trying to force the door open, but it was no use. The room had swallowed me whole. And then I heard it again. The faintest sound, the rustling, this time much closer than before. I wasn't alone, and something inside that room knew it. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that room, locked away with something, or someone, that I couldn't understand. The air around me felt heavier now, as if it had thickened with the presence of something unseen, something watching. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but it was no use. There was no logical explanation. I had come in here to explore, but now I felt trapped in my own home, surrounded by an unseen force. After what seemed like hours, I finally managed to gather my wits. I had to get out. My breath was shallow, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to leave the room and never return. But as I reached for the door handle again, the sudden realization hit me. I didn't want to leave. At least, not yet. There was something I needed to understand. I stepped back, my heart racing as I examined the room once more. Nothing had changed. The walls were still bare, the floor still coated in dust. But there was something unsettling in the air. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift that made my skin crawl. The rustling sound from before had stopped, but the silence felt like a weight pressing against my chest. With trembling hands, I moved to the corner of the room where the rustling had come from. As I reached out to touch the space where the noise had originated, I felt an odd vibration beneath my fingertips. It was faint, like a pulse, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The floorboard beneath me creaked in response, and for a split second, I thought I heard something shift behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Still, I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I had to leave. I had to get out of this room. But as I stepped toward the door again, I noticed something different. A faint smudge of black paint on the floor near the door frame, where the wood met the wall. It looked like a handprint, its edges smeared as if someone had placed their hand there and then dragged it away. I knelt down to get a closer look, and my stomach churned as I traced the outline of the mark. It was cold to the touch, and it left a faint residue on my fingers. I had to get out of there. I pulled at the door handle again, but it was still stuck. The lock wouldn't budge. My frustration grew with every attempt to open the door, but there was no use. The door remained stubbornly closed, mocking my attempts to escape. I turned back toward the room, my gaze landing on the corner once more. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small crack in the wall, barely visible to the naked eye, but it was there. It ran vertically, right in the middle of the wall, as if something had pushed from the other side. The crack was faint, but it was enough to make me pause. It was too perfect, too deliberate. It didn't belong. I placed my hand against the wall, feeling the uneven texture of the crack. As soon as my skin made contact with the surface, the temperature of the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end. I didn't want to, but something deep inside me urged me to press harder, to investigate further. The wall groaned under my touch, as though something was moving on the other side. I stepped back, my heart pounding. There was no way to explain it. The sensation was like nothing I had ever felt before. It was as though the house itself was alive, reacting to my presence, to my curiosity. I felt a sudden urge to leave the room, to leave this entire house, but I couldn't. There was something in me that refused to turn away. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was some morbid curiosity, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening here. I spent the next few days obsessing over the room, trying to piece together whatever was going on. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I kept seeing the handprint, the crack in the wall, and I couldn't stop thinking about the strange vibrations I had felt. Every time I thought I had shaken it off, the memory would resurface, pulling me back into the mystery of that locked room. At night, I started to hear things again. Footsteps. Soft, shuffling steps that echoed through the house, always coming from upstairs. The sound would stop suddenly, only to resume again moments later. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if I was truly hearing something, but either way, it terrified me. I knew no one else was in the house. I had checked every room, but the footsteps continued. I decided to do what I should have done from the beginning. I needed to find out what was behind that door, and I wasn't going to stop until I did. I needed to face whatever it was, no matter how terrifying. The next night, I gathered my tools, a crowbar, a flashlight, and my phone. I couldn't explain why, but I felt as though I was running out of time. There was a sense of urgency now, like something was closing in on me. I went to the door and examined the lock again. I had tried every key, every method, but nothing had worked. The door remained locked. But tonight, I was determined to open it. I pried at the edges of the door frame with the crowbar, the metal scraping against the wood as I worked. It was slow, but eventually I felt it give. The door loosened, and with one final pull, it swung open, creaking on its hinges. I froze. The room beyond the door was not what I expected. It wasn't just empty. It was dark, but the darkness felt thick, like it had weight. It wasn't the kind of darkness you'd expect in a room that had been locked for so long. No, this felt wrong. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of something damp, something ancient. The faint rustling sound was back, but this time it was louder, closer, almost as if it was coming from within the walls themselves. My flashlight flickered as I shone it across the room, but it barely illuminated the space. It was as though the darkness itself was swallowing the light. I stepped inside, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. The temperature dropped, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was so cold in there, colder than the rest of the house. I looked around, but the flashlight beam barely cut through the shadows. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I couldn't leave. Not now. Then, as I moved further into the room, I heard it a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It came from the far corner of the room, where I had seen nothing but dust and cobwebs just moments ago. I turned toward the sound, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the far corner, something shifted. Something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But it was too late. The room had already begun to change. The shadows twisted and shifted, pulling away from the walls and converging in the center of the room. And in that moment, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I wasn't alone anymore. And whatever was in that room with me wasn't going to let me leave. The darkness in the room seemed to ripple and stretch as I stood there, frozen in place, my flashlight quivering in my grip. The faint whispering sound grew louder, and I felt the very air around me tighten like a noose, pulling the breath from my lungs. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of that room and never look back. But my body betrayed me. I couldn't move. The shadows had started to gather in the center of the room, swirling and twisting like tendrils of smoke. It was as if the very walls were alive, breathing, pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. I could feel the temperature dropping further, my fingers growing numb as the cold seeped into my bones. The whispering had turned into a low hum, almost like a chant, a rhythmic pulsing sound that resonated deep in my chest. Then, as if the darkness itself had materialized, something moved within it. I blinked, and it was there. Something tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a face that I couldn't quite make out. It was a silhouette at first, its features indistinct, but as it stepped forward, I could see the outline of something monstrous, something not human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of pale light that seemed to pierce right through me. A rush of panic surged through me, and for the first time since entering the room, I felt the overwhelming urge to flee. But as I tried to turn, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, locking me in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body as if it were trying to break free. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing before me. The creature's movements were unnatural, fluid in a way that no human should be able to move. It shifted through the shadows with an eerie grace, its form bending and twisting in ways that made me question the very laws of nature. Its skin, or whatever passed for skin, was a sickly shade of gray, stretched thin over its bones, and its fingers were too long, too spindly, as if they were meant to grasp and tear rather than touch. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lodged in my throat, suffocated by the sheer terror that gripped me. The thing stopped in front of me, and for a moment, everything went still. Its eyes, those hollow, glowing eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of dread crash over me, washing away all rational thought. It was as though I could feel its presence in my very soul, its essence pressing against me like an invisible weight. My body trembled, my legs weak beneath me, but I stood there, staring into those eyes, unable to break the connection. And then, as if it had read my mind, the creature tilted its head, its neck snapping unnaturally with a sickening crack. It was studying me, analyzing me, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't just observing me. It was feeling me, sensing my fear, drawing strength from it. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel my vision beginning to blur at the edges. My mind raced, scrambling for any kind of logical explanation, but there was none. There was no reason for this, no explanation that could justify what was happening. I was trapped in a nightmare, and this creature, this thing, was the embodiment of that nightmare. It stepped closer, its movements so fluid, so effortless, that it was almost as if it was gliding through the room. The cold was unbearable now, biting into my skin, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. I could see my breath in the air, a cloud of vapor that disappeared almost immediately. And then, the thing reached out a hand toward me. My heart stopped. The fingers were long, claw-like, and I could hear them scraping against the air, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. It touched my shoulder, and the contact sent a shockwave of cold through my entire body. I gasped, stumbling back, but the creature's grip tightened, its fingers digging into my skin as if it were trying to pull me closer. I could feel its breath on my face, a cold, rancid breath that smelled like decay, like death itself. The darkness around us seemed to close in, the room shrinking with every passing second, suffocating me. My chest tightened as if the very air was being squeezed out of me. And then, in a voice that was both distant and right beside my ear, it spoke. The sound was low, guttural, but I could understand it, feel the words resonating deep within me. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through every fiber of my being. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. And in that moment, I realized the truth. Whatever this thing was, whatever had been trapped in this room, it had been waiting for someone to come. It had been waiting for me. I fought to tear myself away, to break free from its grasp, but my legs gave out from beneath me. I fell to the floor, scrambling backward, my eyes never leaving the creature. Its grin, if it could even be called a grin, spread wider, and I felt a cold laugh rumble deep within its chest. The sound was low, a vibration in the pit of my stomach, and it made my skin crawl. "You're too late," It whispered again, its voice barely audible, as if it were speaking through the very fabric of the room itself. The shadows seemed to deepen, swirling around me, closing in like a dark tide. The temperature dropped even further, until I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. I could see nothing but darkness now, but I could still hear its voice, still feel its presence, suffocating me from all sides. I had come here looking for answers, but all I had found was the realization that there were some things that should never be uncovered. There were some doors that should never be opened. And as the creature's laugh echoed in my mind, as the darkness began to close in on me, I knew there would be no escaping it. There would be no escape from this room, from whatever it was that had been trapped here for so long. I had come for answers, but all I had found was the truth. And the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I had opened the door, and now I was part of the room. The moment I thought I had reached the peak of my terror, the room shifted again. The shadows that had suffocated me began to recede, slowly pulling back like a tide. The creature, still looming in front of me, seemed to hesitate, its form flickering as though it were losing cohesion. It was as if something, or someone, had decided that it was time to stop playing with me. It took a step back, its glowing eyes narrowing in an almost calculating manner. I didn't have time to think. Fear took hold of me, and with everything I had left, I scrambled toward the door. The room was still freezing, the air thick with the oppressive weight of its presence, but the creature made no move to stop me. The door, the same one that had locked itself behind me just moments ago, was now standing wide open. It was an escape, a chance. But I didn't dare look back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, to run as fast as I could before the darkness enveloped me once again. My legs felt weak beneath me as I stumbled into the hallway, but I kept moving, my breath racked, my pulse pounding in my ears. I don't know how I made it down the stairs. My vision blurred with panic, my heart a constant thud in my chest, but somehow I reached the front door. It felt as though my hands were shaking violently as I turned the knob, as though the universe itself was testing my resolve to leave. But it opened, and the daylight poured in, filling the space with warmth and light. I bolted outside, breathing in the fresh air as if I had been starved of it for years. The sun, still low in the sky, bathed everything in a golden glow, and I stood there for a moment, just taking it in. The normalcy of it, the peacefulness, felt almost surreal after everything I had just experienced. But as I looked back at the house, something unsettling took hold of me. I had escaped the room. I had survived the encounter with the creature, but there was no sense of closure, no relief. The house seemed to stare back at me, its windows dark, as though it knew I would return, as though it was waiting. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was supposed to do now. The thing that had been in that room, whatever it was, wasn't gone. I could feel it. The air around me still seemed heavy with its presence, its influence lingering. My thoughts were racing. Should I call someone? A specialist? A paranormal investigator? The logical side of my mind told me to get as far away as possible and never look back. But I knew I couldn't just leave things unfinished. There had to be answers. There had to be something I could do. I glanced around, but no one was in sight. The neighborhood seemed completely still, the houses around me quiet and lifeless, as if everything had paused. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. For a moment, I wondered if the encounter had been a product of my mind, a hallucination brought on by stress, exhaustion, or fear. But I knew that wasn't the case. What I had seen, what I had felt, was real. I could still hear the hum of the creature's presence in my ears, as if it was calling to me from the depths of the house. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in my head. The most important thing right now was to leave. Get out of the house, get out of this place, and never look back. I had been lucky to escape, and I needed to hold on to that. I needed to get away while I still could. But as I turned to leave, something stopped me. The door, the one I had just exited through, was now slowly creaking shut. It moved on its own, despite the fact that I was sure I had left it wide open. I froze. The sound of it, that slow, deliberate movement, sent a chill down my spine. And then, the front door clicked shut with finality, as though locking itself. I felt a cold wave of panic hit me once more. I turned back toward the house, and there, standing in the doorway, was the silhouette of the creature. It hadn't followed me out, but it was there, watching from within, its form darker than the shadows around it. My heart pounded in my chest again, but this time I didn't run. Instead, I stood there, staring at the house, unsure of what to do next. There were so many questions I still didn't have answers to. Why had it been waiting for me? How had it been trapped in that room for so long? Was it even the same creature I had seen earlier, or was there something else entirely at work here? I didn't know. I didn't have the answers. But as I turned to leave the property, I made a decision. I would come back. I couldn't let this go, no matter how terrifying it had been. There was something in that house, something that needed to be uncovered, something that had been waiting for someone like me to open the door. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. I didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. My mind was still racing, trying to process everything I had experienced. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the couch, my body still trembling from the encounter. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of those glowing eyes haunted me. The creature's form lingered in my thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't go away. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself it was just a nightmare, just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had unlocked something that shouldn't have been touched. And now, I had no choice but to go back. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and constant unease. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The creature's presence seemed to hang over me, waiting for me to make my move. I knew I had to return to the house. I had to face it, whatever it was. But I didn't know if I would survive the second time. The decision to return to the house was inevitable. I couldn't live with the knowledge that I had left something unfinished. I had gone through too much, felt too much, and seen too much to simply walk away. I had to know what lay beyond the locked door, what had been hidden in that room. I prepared myself for the worst. I packed a small bag, gathering the essentials, a flashlight, a notebook to document everything, and my phone. As I made my way toward the house, a strange calm came over me. My earlier panic, the fear that had consumed me after I escaped, was now replaced by a cold determination. I knew that once I entered that house again, nothing would be the same, but it had to be done. The house stood in front of me like a silent sentinel, its windows dark and its walls still as though waiting for my return. The front door was closed, just as I had left it, but it felt different now. It didn't feel like an ordinary door. It felt like an entry into something much deeper, something that shouldn't be disturbed. Yet, I couldn't turn back now. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling slightly as I gripped it. The moment I touched it, a rush of cold air swept past me, and I almost recoiled, but I steadied myself. I opened the door. The house was silent, too silent. I stepped inside, the creaking floorboards greeting me with an eerie familiarity. The walls seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, making the shadows feel thicker, heavier. I felt a presence immediately, that same feeling of being watched. But this time, it was more than just a sensation, it was tangible. The air was thick with it, like I was walking through a cloud of tension that had settled into every corner of the house. I made my way toward the room, the one I had been drawn to before, the locked room. As I walked down the hallway, the memories of the night I had first encountered the creature flooded back. The strange hum in the air, the flickering of the light, the overwhelming sense of dread that had followed me every step of the way. When I reached the door to the room, I hesitated. The door was still locked, just as I had left it, but something was different this time. There was no resistance, no force that had kept me from opening it before. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but I reached for the doorknob, and this time, it turned easily in my hand. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was as it had been before, dark, cold, and lifeless. But this time, there was no creature, no presence looming in the shadows. The air felt heavy, but not with the same intensity. It was almost as if the room had been waiting for me to confront whatever it had hidden. I walked further into the room, my flashlight scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing had changed. No hidden secrets, no dark corners that I hadn't noticed before. But there was one thing that caught my attention. A strange mark on the floor, near the far corner. It was faded, almost as if it had been erased over time, but it was still there, like a scar left behind by something that had once been. I knelt down to examine it, feeling a strange sense of recognition. The mark was circular, almost like the imprint of something large, something heavy. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew it had been left by the creature, or whatever had been in this room. The realization hit me like a wave. The room wasn't just a place where something dark had been hidden. It was a place that had been waiting for someone to uncover it, to unlock the mystery of its past. And I had been that someone. I stood up, my mind racing. What had I uncovered? What was this place, really? Why had it been kept locked for so long? I felt an overwhelming need to know, to understand the truth behind everything I had experienced. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible noise, like a whisper in the back of my mind. It wasn't coming from the room, but from somewhere deeper in the house. The sound was distant, but it carried with it an unmistakable sense of urgency. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone since the moment I stepped inside this house. The presence was here, waiting for me, lurking in the shadows, just beyond my reach. I turned toward the hallway, the source of the sound drawing me in. The air seemed to thicken again, heavier than before, as if the house was alive, reacting to my every move. The walls closed in around me, and the floor beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, as though the house itself was moving. I took a deep breath, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know if I could survive whatever was coming next. But I couldn't leave. I had come this far, and I couldn't back down now. The sound grew louder, more distinct, pulling me forward. And as I took that first step into the darkness, I realized that I wasn't just uncovering a mystery. I was becoming a part of it. The house, the creature, the locked room. It was all connected. And I had opened the door, not just to the room, but to something far deeper, something that would never let me go. And so, as I stepped deeper into the shadows, I knew that there was no escaping what I had unleashed. The locked room was never just a room. It was a portal. And once I had opened it, there was no closing it again. The darkness closed in around me, and everything went silent.